Versatile Layer, Book 01. The Red Girl.
War. How does it start? How does a seed of misunderstanding burrow deep into man's fractured soul, then grow into a flaming tree of violence? How did the warm flow of blood become normal? What gain is there to war? How does hatred for a race become the lens through which we see things? Why can't our differences be the unifying trait of our similarities? Questions swirl in my head like the vultures I read about. How did this war begin? The same way all wars begin. It slowly starts because people are afraid and don't understand each other. They allow silly notions to darken common sense until it snowballs. Why do I fight in the war? Because the war is my fault.
Chapter 1. The Wreckage. Planet Jophiel. Travis Takeda summoned the members of his salvage crew with a wild, impatient hand gesture. Around him was nothing but space dust that extended for undulating leagues, that sometimes jutted out abruptly before flattening out. They were searching for relics and data on Jophiel, which was the fifth planet from the Sun and the closest to neutral territory. Beyond this neutral space was Samael, the home planet of the Arez. Terrans and the Arez had been at war 80 years ago. Then the makeshift pact was initiated after both sides suffered heavy losses. The cause of the war was wrapped in shadows and unclear facts. But the pain it caused still remained in the graves that swallowed the dead and the hearts of loved ones left behind. Survival relied solely on cordoning off certain sectors as neutral zones that served as binding ropes to a peace that was waiting to break. The final battle took place in the orbit of Jophiel, and a great many battleships crashed upon the surface of the behemoth world. So it made perfect sense for Travis and his crew to come salvaging here. He could have used his communicator, but his excitement inhibited his ability to keep the cool required to operate it. The spacesuit that housed Travis was large and awkward. As he waved his hands above his head, then from side to side he looked like a man-sized toddler. An unenthusiastic, older gentleman with a snout and receding hairline sat in the cockpit of the freighter, not far away from where Travis waved. He slightly rolled his eyes as he observed Travis through the viewport. It seemed Travis had found something significant beyond the ridge he was perched on and was excited for them to come over to where he was. The man with the snout called it in on his communicator.
Attention all. Sal here. Travis needs everyone by the ridge close to the freighter. Seems important.
Static followed the curt announcement, followed by abrupt silence.
Any idea what it is?
Asked a voice marked by excitement.
No idea. Just bring yourself here before he loses his arms in a bid to get our attention.
Although Travis owned the salvage company and didn't have to do surface walks himself, he nevertheless partook in every part of it. In simpler terms, it could be said that he enjoyed breathing in the air on other planets. Technically, it was oxygen from his own world forced into a tank. Nonetheless, he looked forward to the adventure afforded by the trek and liked to stretch his legs from time to time. The thrill-seeker disappeared beyond the ridge when he saw 3 of his crew emerge from the freighter's airlock. Their spacesuits were 2 shades duller than his and not as ill-fitting. When the crew caught up to Travis, he was standing before the wreckage of an Arez cruiser. This vessel was different from the other ships he had salvaged off Jophiel. For one, it was torn apart, but for some strange reason, the pieces that were strewn across the ground still had power. This was a recent crash, he surmised.
Something is off here.
Travis muttered to himself.
What's fishy?
Oh, these panels shouldn't be powered. This is a very recent crash, probably hours ago.
If the Arez are active on Jophiel, we should...
Did I ask for your input, Sal?
What?
Sal asked in confusion.
If I need to know the best bars on Lhasa, I'll call you, Sal. But for now, how about you let the grown-ups figure this out?
Sal was offended, but he didn't say anything in response. He cut off his comm, then muttered,
Cocky though scruff. Say that to me on the street.
Travis continued his contemplation. His crew arrived and looked on in silence. At times like this, it was better to let Travis go through the motions and calculate whatever was going on in his mind. There was nothing they could do once he made it to the second level of his oddity. The first level usually involved him asking them questions. By the second level, it becomes a case of Travis speaking. Travis, and this was a language none of them spoke well. Slowly, he touched the glass shield on his helmet with his slightly bent index finger. He had worn glasses in his youth and had developed a habit of poking the frame on the bridge of his nose. Even though he no longer needed the aid of prescription glasses, he still adjusted his non-existent specs.
No bodies.
He finally said after a long pause in contemplation.
How do we have a crash with no bodies? Not even a pilot.
His brows formed waves of confusion and he licked his lips hastily.
Hughes, go back to the top of the ridge and keep your eyes peeled.
The short, squat man called Hughes made a run for the ridge. They all knew to swiftly obey Travis when he got like this. On more than one occasion, it had been established that their survival relied on how quickly they obeyed him because it usually meant danger was around.
Sal, bring the freighter real close. We have to work quickly.
As Travis hurriedly issued commands, he noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A purple glow emanated from the wreckage.
Crystals.
He thought out loud. Crystals powered Arez technology and could only be found on their homeworld. These crystals contained enormous amounts of power and were in high demand. After decades of crews salvaging the wreckage on Jophiel, these crystals had all but vanished. Travis knew how much he would get if he actually brought in a crystal. They would all be set for life and have no need for work ever again. His thoughts fished images of his wife and son and how proud their smiles were.
Work faster, people.
He commanded with a needless wave of his arms. There was an eagerness eating at him. The salvage crew worked hard to remove the debris concealing the glowing object. Travis hopped from side to side and directed their efforts. His eagerness was loud enough to be heard in all the systems. Finally, the final layer was reached. Travis looked excited by what was before him. Chapter 2. High Fives. Lhasa Colony. Jake. A woman's voice bounced on the walls of the sparse and unkempt room. Jake! Came the voice again with sternness. There was no response from the sleeping person on the bed. Jake, wake up! The scream got a response this time. A grunt, nothing more. The source of the sound was a hologram that lit up next to the head of the bed. Jake rolled off the bed and fell to the floor with a thud. His sluggish movements screamed half asleep. He reached for the nightstand from the floor, feeling his way with slightly long digits that came away with his glasses. He put them on, sighed, then rolled on his back. Jake! Came the woman's voice once again with undertones of annoyance. Jake bolted right up, then adjusted his glasses with his index finger. He let them settle near the bridge of his nose.
Mom, I'm awake. Eva, stop yelling now.
Do you have any idea how long I have been calling out to you? Do you have any idea what time it is? You are practically late for...
It couldn't have been more than 5 minutes. I was somehow never going late.
Don't talk smart to me this morning. It's too early.
Be smart, they say.
He said in a low growl. Her brows arched and her mouth pursed. What was that?
Oh, nothing, Mom. Be down in a bit.
She rolled her eyes before the hologram went off. Jake stood up from the floor as he pulled a half-finished puzzle cube off his bed. It was partially completed, save for some 12 or so mismatched colors. He had fallen asleep while playing with it the night before. He must have been really tired because sleep hardly overtook him while he solved a cube. The puzzle cube was the one thing that helped clear his mind at the end of the day. It was the one tool that could puncture his clouded thoughts and file away his sometimes muddied thought process. He tapped the black Navi device strapped to his wrist and with a few clicks pulled up the Shangri-La Ghost server. Shingla LHSMSRV 1976 upload.dat. 20 minutes later, Jake walked down the spiral staircase that opened into the kitchen. He had showered and donned his school uniform, which included a black jacket, white button-down shirt with black tie, and checkered slacks tucked into calf-high socks with a diamond pattern. A leather briefcase was slung over his shoulder, containing his datapad for his studies. Both hands held the puzzle cube, and his face was painted with concentration. The black jacket he wore matched his curly hair that was almost always unkempt, despite its large mass. His glasses frame disappeared into the wild mane before reaching his ears. Feature-wise, Jake was a compromise between both of his parents. Although he was closer to his mother's soft, dark complexion, he possessed his father's eyes and jawline, which was the trademark of a blooded Takeda. He was about an average height for a 16-year-old. His mother, Annabelle Takeda, was at the kitchen table when he came down. Her arms were folded over her chest. She was strikingly different from the holographic image from before. Currently, a Narikov 4 pedestrian chassis housed her. It was a sleek, metallic, almost silver robotic body. These bodies were commonly referred to as frames, as they served as hosts to the mind of the owner. Her organic body had perished years ago from complications during childbirth. Like all productive members of society, her mind was accepted into the Shangri-La Ghost server upon physical death. She wanted to be there for her son whenever he needed her, and the frame system provided that. Frames afforded loved ones the room to physically and mentally interact with those they had lost. At great expense, Travis purchased a frame for Annabelle to be downloaded into. When they first became available ages ago, frames were a rarity and costly. This made them only available to the wealthy and elite class of society. But with strides in technology, they became common. Annabelle was wearing a white sleeveless blouse with a navy blue dress that draped her legs down to her ankles. Slim, polished metallic arms that bragged of impeccable craftsmanship came out of the blouse's opening. When close enough, one could almost make out their reflection on certain parts of her body. Like the vast majority of frames in circulation, she dressed her new body in the same manner as her original. This wasn't an unnatural tendency for the minds downloaded from the server. Jake dropped his school bag on a chair at the table as he walked past his mother to the kitchen counter. He put down the cube before reaching into the cupboard above his head. His hands came away with a box. He poured the content of the box into a machine on the counter close to the sink and punched in some buttons. Almost instantly it beeped. Then he proceeded to remove a small tray of scrambled eggs being conveyed through an opening in the front.
No cheese?
Jake groaned as he flopped down onto the chair behind him. He refused to meet her gaze, but could feel his mother peering at him as he took a bite. He knew that she knew. There was no point in hiding it any longer.
I guess you got a call from the campus administrator?
He said nonchalantly. There was a long pause before she spoke. Jake thought she had not heard him. The administrator said you've been late for first period every day this week, which is strange because you leave this house with ample time to get to school on time. For a second, Jake was taken aback by the redundant structure of Anne's last sentence. There was no strain in her voice, even though he could tell she was visibly upset. That was the thing about his mother. Her voice could lie about her emotions. He had to learn this fact through experience, and on a lot of those occasions favor wasn't on his side. Mentally, he ran the numbers and the sentences that could get him sorted quickly. He tried to come up with a satisfactory answer that would also get him out of the house without unnecessary drama. Nothing particular was coming to his mind. Rather, with every possibility of success, he saw many routes by which they would fall flat. He decided to concentrate on his food and buy more time. The scrambled eggs went into his mouth by the shovels, while his eyes darted in various directions. The back door flew open as Travis Takeda exploded into the kitchen.
Last night I came across the greatest find of my career,
Travis announced loudly. Travis was the stark opposite of Annabelle when it came to his voice and emotions. Every ounce of his emotions found their way into his voice. He could be unusually loud at such moments. He grinned ear to ear and held up both hands to receive high fives from his wife and son. Jake immediately seized the opportunity to escape. In a swift motion, he jumped from the kitchen table, collected his school bag and puzzle cube, then slapped his father's palm as he slipped past him through the door to freedom.
Wow, that's great news, Pops,
he said while shutting the door. Annabelle didn't realize what had happened until the door closed. She made a dash for the door, spinning Travis in the process. "We are not done here, young man," she yelled as soon as she yanked the door open. He was already on the street with a mischievous grin on his face.
I'm going to be late.
He yelled as he started to jog.
Gotta go,
he added with a wave. Anne's countenance grew dark. She turned back to face Travis, who still had his hand raised and a ridiculous grin in place. When have I ever responded to your high-five requests? You are just the worst. She exited the kitchen with a shake of her head. Showing up at the most awkward of times and undermining my parenting skills. Travis couldn't make out her grumble or why he was being blamed for what just happened.
Something I said?
He asked no one in particular. Travis was all alone in the kitchen with a plate of unfinished breakfast. Chapter 3. Jake's Dilemma. Jake took the long way to school. He weaved in and out of the back alleys to avoid the main city walkways. There was a method to his madness. He was intentionally trying to arrive minutes after the opening bell, so he could make it to class in one piece. Sure, the instructor would have words for him, but that would be far better than the torment David Assad and his gang of ruffians would put him through. Since the beginning of the semester, Jake had become their favorite new target. Every day in the courtyard before that opening bell, they would corner him and bully him in front of his classmates. No one ever stepped in to help. They were all suddenly blind, or struck with a strange paralysis. They were all too afraid, and he didn't blame them. He wouldn't step in for a wimp like himself. Too much hassle. When he thought about how the tirade had started, his emotions became undecided and muddled. This daily ritual of torment started over something very small and equally ridiculous. A belly button. He allowed his mind the freedom to reel back the memory of the day his predicament began. It was a week after the new semester had started. Proctors were brought in to conduct the colonial fitness evaluation. The exam was pretty straightforward. Basic calisthenics, followed by a jogging lap around the campus, and finally a rope climb in the gym. Jake took notice of David and one of his minions as a part of his examination group. They were already notorious on the campus grounds, and he wanted to stay off their radar. During the first 2 segments of the exams, he made sure to keep his distance. He had successfully managed to place himself at the opposite end of whatever space they claimed as their territory. There were casualties along the way. Sam Higgins from freshman class B got his pants yanked down to his ankles during jumping jacks. Kurt Morrison, a junior from class F, was tripped up and he fell into the foliage during the campus jog. Catherine Harris, another freshman from class B, was teased about the size of her forehead during push-ups. This went on until she broke down and cried. Jake remained out of the fray. All was going according to plan until the final activity of the examination, the rope climb. All the students were sent up in pairs to the 2 ropes, dangling from the gym ceiling. There was no way to stay invisible when you're being called out in front of the group. Jake did a quick head count. He figured out a way to position himself so that he wouldn't be noticed. He successfully managed to finagle a place 4 spots after David in the opposite line. This way, the terror of Bowie Academy would be walking back towards a crowd of students who had already completed the climb just as Jake's turn at the rope came. There was one miscalculation, though. Sam Higgins was in line before David. Higgins had such a fear of heights that his turn lasted forever. By the time Higgins completed his climb, Jake was standing beside David Assad. They both walked forward and grabbed their respective ropes. Jake's heart was an inch away from bursting, and his mind was a collection of scattered thoughts. He swallowed hard and stole a glance at David, who was also sizing him up. Their eyes met, and Jake averted his gaze quickly.
You got a problem, Slick?
David snarled with a cold look.
Problem? Why would I have a problem? Except if it's a quadratic or simultaneous equation. I sometimes have a problem with those, but I don't see how this relates to that or,
Jake stopped speaking the moment he realized he was rambling.
Oh, problem.
He said with a nervous laugh, then gestured at the ropes.
You mean with the, No, I'm, of course, there's no problem.
I don't need your life story, smart guy.
David said with a sneer.
Of course you don't. That would take time and would definitely bore you. We're in agreement regarding that.
Anybody ever tell you that you talk too much? Just don't get in my way.
Jake nodded emphatically. David was possibly the largest and most athletically inclined student on campus, but oddly enough, he wasn't on any of the academy's sports teams. As soon as the buzzer went off, he was up and down the rope quickly. Jake was relieved to know that David would be gone by the time he got back down on the gym floor, crisis averted. But David, in a bid to show off to the girls in the group, climbed the rope a second time. The boys made it down from the ropes at about the same time. Jake's gym shirt got tangled with the rope and exposed his stomach to the group. He was more concerned with not ruining his shirt, and therefore thought nothing of the accident. As he began untangling his shirt from the line, he heard David's voice.
What the heck is that, weirdo?
David laughed as he pointed at Jake's stomach. But the most common method of procreation in the 13 Terran colonies was through cloning. The cells of both parents are cultivated, combined, and used to grow a child via the cloning matrix, lovingly referred to as mother. This system was developed as a more efficient mode of procreation. The standard method was too unpredictable for a populace that existed primarily in a manufactured ecosystem. Population control was essential for the survival of the colonists. The gender of the child was chosen by an algorithm within mother to maintain an essential balance of males to females in the population. The pods that housed the clones as they grew contained a fluid that nourished them until birth, which discarded the need for a belly button. Jake's father was a bit of a goofball in his youth. He failed to register his DNA for processing when he turned 25. So when he and Anne got married and decided they wanted to have a child, their request to use mother was put into the backlog. This meant they could potentially be made to wait 10 years before their turn would come around. Of course, they didn't want to wait, but there was no way forward. Natural procreation was frowned upon by popular society. For one, the child came with a bag of diseases that were unknown to the colonists. There was no one alive with pediatric knowledge as relating to natural birth, and because of this, natural birth was discouraged and often dangerous. But Travis and Anne saw no other option but to try their luck. Who could wait 10 years before they would get to hold a child in their arms? So, Jake was conceived the old way. Apart from the death of his mother during his birth, everything about him was normal. Like the children made from mother, he didn't suffer much illness, and his growth wasn't stunted. Being different had never been an issue for Jake, until David pointed at his belly button. David made a spectacle of it, and even coerced the entire group into pointing at it and laughing. Life at school had been that way ever since that day. Eventually, David grew wise and discovered what the odd object on Jake's stomach was. From that day forward, Jacob's name on campus became Buttons. Every day brought on a new humiliation at the hands of David and his goons. For the past week, Jake had arrived late to school so he could walk to class in peace. But today was different. Upon arrival at the main gate, he scanned the courtyard before he made a move to enter. Before he set foot on the school grounds, he noticed movement behind the steps leading up to the main entrance of the school. Quickly, he pressed his back to the archway of the gate, and then carefully peeked back into the courtyard. He realized that the movement was by Earl Smith, one of David's lackeys. Earl usually played the role of the lookout for the group, and was the last person you would want to meet. There was no doubt, in Jake's mind, that David and the gang were waiting on the other side of the entrance for him. The likely plan would be, once Earl signaled the group of his arrival, they would proceed to pounce on him. Jake's stomach felt queasy. He wasn't in the mood to soak up any abuse today. There was no way he would be able to survive this onslaught without losing his mind. Slowly, he peeled his back from the archway without making a sound. He tiptoed along the outer barrier wall of the school grounds, while contemplating his current dilemma. He was so lost in thought that the end of the wall escaped his notice as he wandered into the morning rush of crowds that flooded the walkways off campus. Everyone was in a mad rush, which was typical of weekdays. The sound of a school bell in the distance woke Jake from his trance-like state. He recognized the chime as the sound of first period ending. He had been lost in a sea of thoughts and wandering for close to an hour. It was then that it dawned on him that he had just inadvertently cut school. He had by no choice of his own joined the clan of miscreants that disregarded the rules of polite society. Jake considered what to do with this ill-gotten free time that he had just stolen. Nothing spectacular came to mind. He needed to go to a place where he wouldn't be questioned about school. What he needed, he thought, was free time from all the rules, structures, and everything else that did not contribute to his sanity nor understood his dilemma. A light bulb came on after much thought. He decided to go to nowhere. Shingla LHSMSRV 1976 upload.dat Chapter 4: Trial of Nowhere. Nowhere was a back alley off of Gruber Street. It wasn't a long walk from the Bowie Academy campus. As the crow flies, 15 minutes was all it would take. Jake arrived without making a sound, then proceeded to carefully inspect the alley from afar before entering. This alley was a hotspot that drew in delinquents and other tough teenagers. Usually the place was packed full of them, and it was dangerous to come close by at such times. Luckily for him today, he was the only delinquent who decided to skip school. He was as safe as a mouse when the house cat was on vacation. The scientists and station administrators quickly discovered it was impossible to perfectly simulate gravity across the entire colony. In some places, anomalies developed like dimensional shifts and irregular gravity. Although they tried to correct this natural error, none of the remedies took. Soon, the knowledge was out and the outlaws of society converged at these spots. Nowhere was one of the few places on the colony with irregular gravity. These spots were so few and could be counted on the fingers of one hand. In these irregular gravitational fields, one could jump higher than normal, then float back down to the ground. The space colony was a globe, with the environment lining the inner shell and the sky at the center. If one jumped high enough, they could see through the clouds and glimpse the cityscape on the opposite side of the station. This was a thrilling adventure for teens and dreamers alike. Jake had never seen this. Jake had heard a story about a boy who jumped 50 feet into the air. According to the story, the boy saw the other side clear as day, but then continued to float. He couldn't return to the ground, and he just floated away, never to be seen again. It sounded like a silly urban legend, but deep down, Jake believed it. This fear kept him from jumping up more than 30 feet. Every time he tried to break free from his inhibitions, the story arose in his mind and grounded him to the spot. Jake did a few moments of pre-jump stretching before his first practice leap. This low-effort attempt got him up about 5 feet. The next jump cleared him of 7 feet. Now, it was time to get serious. He crouched down low, almost into a runner's starting stance, then propelled himself upward. He easily soared about 15 feet. He continued to jump up, then float back to the ground. For a moment he thought that maybe it wouldn't be so bad to just float away. He jumped again. On his way up, he dodged a clothesline drawn between two balconies. At 30 feet high, he squinted his eyes, and he could almost make out the cityscape on the opposite side of the colony. Faint shapes of buildings just beyond the clouds. As Jake began to float downward, he looked toward the street. He could see a station security patrol near the alley entrance below. If they spotted him ditching school, he'd be in hot water. His heart began to play a bass line to the rhythm of fear orchestrated on the strings of his nerves. 2 officers turned into the alley. Nowhere was a known delinquent hangout by authorities, so routine patrols were mandatory. Jake realized that within minutes, these officers would be close enough to see him. He feverishly flapped his arms upward in a vain attempt to descend faster. It was no use. He started to panic as the officers entered the area below. If they looked up, they would see him. He remembered the clothesline strewn between the 2 buildings he passed on the way up. He kicked his legs back as he thrust his arms forward. He spun in a circle head over heels as he reached out for the line beneath him. It was slightly out of his grasp. On the next spin, he was beneath the line. He stretched his fingers out to their limit to take hold of the line. If he missed, there was no telling what position he would be in when gravity reasserted itself upon him. There was every possibility he would land on his neck. Panic began to set in. Every muscle in his back tensed as he reached for the line. His fingertips grazed the line. He missed. His only hope now was to yell at the officers when he was close enough. Maybe they could catch him before his head hit the ground. His thoughts spun in a crazy frenzy in tandem with his view. Everything was a blur, meshed into another blur. It'd be far better to deal with his angry parents than to potentially split open his head. As he opened his mouth to scream out help, he stopped spinning for some unknown reason. He looked up frantically in search of his salvation and noticed that the heel of his shoe had caught onto the line. He struggled to reach up to grab the line with his hands. He heard calm chatter below. It was the station officer's communicators being overly loud. If they looked up, they would see him struggling with the wire. Jake got a firm grip on the line as gravity gradually reasserted itself upon his body. If he didn't make it to the balcony in time, the line would snap under his weight. The station security officers listened intently to the departmental updates on their comm units as Jake struggled to navigate the clothesline. He became tangled in a blouse on the line as he progressed. It fell and drifted down towards the officers. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring against him. His arms burned more and more as his weight increased. The line tightened, ready to snap at any moment. The blouse flopped onto one of the officers' helmets. They snapped their gazes upward, almost in unison, to inspect the origin of the piece of fabric. Clothes were raining down from the sky. The broken line dangled from the side of the building. The officer pulled the blouse from his helmet, and the two looked at each other, puzzled. High above the scene, Jake gasped for air as he lay on the floor of the balcony. He was exhausted from his little adventure. He couldn't stop his left hand from shaking as he caught his breath. As the moment passed, he finally managed to compose himself. He pulled himself up to his feet using the balcony railing. A light on the control panel next to the balcony's entrance changed from red to yellow. The door slid open. An elderly woman emerged from the apartment with a broom in her hands. The two locked eyes. She raised the broom above her head like a warrior's axe and let out a shrill battle cry as she swung it at Jake. He dodged the attack and scrambled through her apartment towards the front door.
Ma'am, this isn't what it looks like.
His words fell on deaf ears.
I swear on my mother's frame, this is a big misunderstanding. I'm not a thief or anything.
She pursued him, her little feet shuffling across the floor as she waved her broom around like a tornado. Jake fumbled with the door panel until it slid open, and he fell out into the vacant hallway. The old woman angrily shook her broom at him from her doorway as he jogged away from her down the hall and around a corner. Jake laughed to himself for a minute as he leaned back against the hallway wall. He had run for dear life from a woman he could have easily tackled. He chuckled hard at his cowardice, then gathered himself and walked towards where he thought the nearest lift would be. As he walked, he wondered if delinquency was his true calling in life. He seemed to get a real thrill out of it. The idea eventually faded. Delinquents probably don't make it into Shangri-La, he thought. Paradise has no need for troublemakers. It was what he was taught since before he could speak. Only productive members of society with character were worthy of the Shangri-La server. Shangla LHS SRV 000976 upload. There were still hours left before the closing bell. It would be suspicious to return home before the school day ended, so Jake was trying to figure out what to do until then. He remembered his father's claim of finding something incredible while salvaging on the surface of Jophiel. Travis's salvage yard wasn't too far away. Jake could quietly slip into his father's workshop and take a peek at what his old man was bragging about. It's not like he had anything better to do. Chapter 5. Discovery. There was no one about when he entered the salvage yard. Nevertheless, he paused and held his breath when the gate creaked as he slid into it. He felt like a ninja from one of those ancient texts he had read on the Interstellar Library. His stealthy movements were a bit exaggerated and unnecessary as he tiptoed past his father's salvage ship parked on the landing pad. He reached the door to his father's workshop. It was locked by a touch panel with a passcode. Jake shook his head as he typed in his birth date to unlock the door.
Way to be up.
He crept inside and the door slid shut behind him. Out of the corner of his eye, Jake caught the faintest glow of purple light. He turned towards his father's tool dolly, and there lay the source of the light. Slowly, he approached the glowing object that had called for his attention. Fear and trepidation ran the course of his mind, body, and spirit. Upon closer inspection, the object looked like a large egg that flattened out at the bottom. He was transfixed for a moment before slowly making for the bizarre device. From the architecture and conversations going on in his head, Jake decided the object before him was obviously alien and possibly dangerous. But there was no way he would not investigate. Curiosity was responsible for the death and skinning of cats. Throwing in his lot with the felines was all that consumed him. As he got closer, the light emanating from the alien device bathed him in a subtle glow that accentuated his features. He stood before the egg-shaped device and gulped. The purple lights danced and intersected upon its surface. Jake had always been commended for being astute and perceptive for a boy his age. By nature, he sought patterns out of chaos and thrived on solving problems everyone else had given up on. His mother had figured this trait when he was 3 and had him enrolled in a course specially tailored for gifted kids. Without much effort, he aced all the classes and got put into the accelerator program. The station administrators had high hopes for him after he helped solve a police case that was hinged on a clue they were missing. To him, everything was obvious because of the way he approached the world. It surprised him greatly to discover that what was normal for him was strange for others, and the patterns that formed his life were missing in the lives of others, his parents inclusive. Within an instant, he noticed the movement of the light wasn't chaotic. There was a pattern to this concocted madness. The lights lingered on some areas for nanoseconds longer than others, and then took on a subtle shade as they moved. To the perceptive eye, a sequence presented itself. Eagerness mixed with joy flooded Jake's vein as he stretched forth his hand to interact with the pattern he had noticed. He led his hand into the first cluster of light as they grouped together. The purple lights morphed into a diamond-like shape. The other dancing lights changed into a different shade of purple. Jake's hypothesis was correct. He let a smile tug at the corners of his lips. In his awe, he missed his cue to secure the next light cluster. The first cluster dispersed, and the egg returned to its previous state. He took 2 steps back. Fear gripped the base of his spine.
Wait, what am I doing? Anything could be inside of this. It could be a bomb or a virus.
His eyes went wide as a slew of imagination and realization flooded his mind space.
Calm down. Full breaths.
He breathed in, then out, then in and out, then stopped. He studied the lights a while longer, then shook his head. Indecision formed a thick black cloud over him, and his mind went into a tumult. He managed to walk half the distance back towards the entrance before dropping his briefcase and returning to the egg.
I'll just try a few more sequences, but if it looks like it's about to open, then I'll stop.
He nodded.
I'll have to stop. Of course I will.
He nodded once more, this time with determination. Against his better judgment, Jake continued experimenting with the light sequences on the egg. He found that if he wasn't fast enough, the entire sequence would reset itself back to its default state. It wasn't enough to just react to the light sequences. After the initial sequence, he would have to predict the future sequences just to keep up with the lights. The more he tried to solve it, the more complicated the puzzle became. It was possibly the most fascinating puzzle that Jake had ever attempted. He continued to interact with the lights on the egg. Each failed attempt followed immediately by starting over from the beginning. This cycle continued for half an hour. The lights got faster, almost as if they were learning from Jake's incessant punching. He entered a trance-like state as his hands danced upon the egg's surface. Unlike the other puzzles he solved in the past, this puzzle required more than intellect to crack the code. It required his intuition, dexterity, his spirit. Every part of him needed to be in sync if he was to break through. It would take his all to solve this puzzle. Unknown to Jake, an Aurora Borealis-type light had filled the hangar. He was so transfixed on his task that he didn't notice anything outside of himself. His hands moved on their own as if his mind and body were perfectly in sync. He had never felt this in the moment before. This must have been what the coach at the academy meant by in the zone. He moved his arms like a music conductor as he stayed in sync with the movement of the lights. He touched the final notes of the light symphony, and a wave of pressure from the egg knocked him down onto the floor. He looked up and finally noticed the Aurora Borealis. It was both beautiful and horrifying.
Oh shit.
The egg was opening. Jake jumped to his feet and attempted to hold it shut, but to no avail. It slowly opened, pushing him away. A blue mist poured out of the alien egg. He couldn't make out what was inside. As the mist began to dissipate, the lights started to dim. Jake covered his mouth and nose with his hand after realizing what had happened. If the mist contained a virus, it was far too late for him. His thoughts ran like wildfire. He wondered if he had inadvertently poisoned everyone on the colony. He couldn't help but smell the mist as it seeped through the ingenious hand mask that he so expertly crafted on the fly. It was a sweet aroma, akin to strawberries, but not quite. A smell that pleasant couldn't possibly be poisonous, he thought. He slowly lowered his hand from his face. He could now clearly see what resided within the egg-like object. Chapter 6. The Red Girl. On the surface of Jophiel, amongst the wreckage previously discovered by Travis Takeda, stood 3 tall, ominous figures. Their spacesuits weren't as cumbersome and awkward as his. These suits were form-fitting with domed helmets. Tubes connected the helmet to a small container on the upper back, which held breathable air. These suits were designed for mobility, stealth, and, if need be, combat. The 3 were all female, and the shortest among them stood 6'3". Belts slung about their hips held various gadgets and weapons. On their backs, within sheaths, next to their breathing apparatuses, were their signature weapons. A sword with a hilt that closely resembled a shotgun stock. When the trigger is pulled, the swords vibrate at a frequency matching that of a crystal within the hilt. At this frequency, the sword was capable of cutting through just about anything. It was a deadly weapon, almost as deadly as the 3 warriors who wielded it. The 3 searched the wreckage for the missing object, but it was already gone. One of the women jumped into the sky. She twirled and landed gracefully on the top of the ridge that Travis Takeda had stood on. She held her hand to her helmet, then uttered some indiscernible words in an alien language. Purple lights filled the space above her head and circled for a few seconds before flying through the sky to light the surface of a ship. The ship was massive. It was the only visible object in the sky from where she stood. The Juggernaut was the largest battleship in the galaxy and the worst beast any nation should come against. No one had seen one in so long. The massive ship ascended into the heavens above Jophiel. There was no sound or fanfare. Death never needed an announcement. Meanwhile, in Travis Takeda's workshop, Jake stared into the open pod. Within the egg-like object was a girl. She was curled up into a fetal position while the mist gently poured forth from the capsule. Her skin was a deeper shade of red. The points of her ears were sharper than a human's. Her hair was a dark mix of purple and red and as wild as Jake's mane. She wore a form-fitting flight suit with trim edges that softly glowed purple. Her unmoving form suggested she was asleep, but Jake surmised that she was in stasis. The girl slowly opened her eyes. Her irises were a vivid blue, almost neon. This especially stood out due to how dark around the iris was. The whites of her eyes were a dark grayish color. She had full lips, and as she let out a yawn, her visible canine teeth were slightly longer than a human's. Jake nervously watched from afar. He was mesmerized and scared at the same time. She slowly sat upright inside the open pod and let out another yawn. She stretched her full length and took a step outside of the pod. Her height became apparent to Jake immediately as she got out. She had to be, at the very least, over 6 feet tall. Jake gulped and choked on his spit. The alien girl turned her drowsy gaze upon him. She stood there quietly studying him.
And Arez.
Jake uttered in awe.
Here on Lhasa?
He had heard stories of the Arez, the hostile alien species that wanted his entire race exterminated, the violent tribes who would attack his people without provocation. It was said that they would even devour Terrans when they were hungry enough. Jake had heard all of the horror stories, and he had a healthy fear of the Arez. But he had never seen an Arez in person before. This girl didn't seem like a savage out for his blood. Regardless of their physical differences, and, for some strange reason, Jake actually thought she was pretty. Maybe the Arez weren't the monsters that he had been taught about. The girl bared her teeth at Jake, and her eyes took on a shade of vicious intent.
Please don't eat me,
he whispered just before he took off running. He made a dash for the door. The Arez girl fell over as she took a swipe at him. She was still woozy from being in stasis. Jake tripped over his own feet and fell before the door. He crawled to his knees and struggled to disengage the lock. Jake heard the girl screaming in Arez behind him. He scurried away from the door on his hands and knees. The girl slammed against the door as she missed grabbing onto him. She disorientedly pulled herself up using the door frame to steady herself. Jake got to his feet and clumsily ran away. He tapped away at his Navi as he ran. There wasn't much space in the workshop and no adequate places to hide. He pushed a rolling tool dolly toward the girl as she approached. He was barely strong enough to move it. It slowly rolled toward the girl. She grabbed the tool dolly by the top and hurled it into a wall.
If she hits me like that, I'm dead.
His heart was beating out of his chest. Was this how it would end for him? Jake tried to dash around her to reach the door, but he was way too slow. She snatched him up by the front of his shirt and pushed his back against the door. His feet dangled above the floor. She was speaking Arez at him. Jake frantically typed out a sequence on his Navi. If this didn't work, he was done for.
Give me one reason not to kill you,
she said through her teeth. She was still speaking her language, but the Navi had interpreted her words. Jake could understand her now.
Why would you want to kill me in the first place?
She turned her head to the left, then the right. He realized he understood her, but she didn't understand him. He tapped out another sequence on the Navi device.
Please don't eat me,
Jake screeched. A moment later, the Navi device on his wrist translated his words into Arez. The girl had a look of surprise on her face.
You think I am trying to eat you?
Yes.
Jake meekly replied. She stared at him a while longer, then said,
That is offensive. What kind of person eats people?
Jake didn't know how to respond.
What is this place? How many of you are there?
She was speaking so fast that her language was overlaying the translation from the Navi.
Are you planning to experiment on me?
Wait, I love to answer all your questions, but this is counterproductive. If you release me, I could probably fix our language problem.
How do I know this is not a trap?
Jake breathed slowly to calm himself.
If I'm lying, you can eat me.
She squinted her eyes at him after the translation reached her ears. She wasn't amused. Reluctantly, she released Jake. Jake cautiously backed up towards his father's desk, careful to keep his eyes on her. The red girl stalked him closely, untrusting of him. Jake searched the drawers of his father's desk. After some digging, he found an earpiece.
Perfect,
he whispered. He linked the earpiece to his Navi and made some modifications.
Okay, I'm not sure of your brain structure, so I can't authorize direct input to your synapses, but this earpiece should work linking you to my Navi.
She didn't respond. She continued to glare at him with a hint of confusion in her eyes. Jake gestured to his ear and mouth, then reached the earpiece towards her ear.
Put this in your ear.
She snatched it from his hand and snarled at him before considering the device. Eventually, she put it on her ear. A whir started, followed by a beep on Jake's Navi.
This should make talking less of a chore.
Jake's words flowed in impeccable Arez.
We shall see, Terran.
She was surprised to hear her words flow in a different language.
Jacob Takeda,
he said.
My name is Jacob Takeda, or just Jake for short. My friends call me Jake. Got a lot of friends, best buds.
Jake didn't have any friends.
What's your name?
She stared at him.
My name is none of your concern. My concern is escape. I am not here to play with my captors.
You are not a prisoner,
Jake replied.
I don't know the whole story, but you were found on Jaffiel. Your ship was wrecked, and somehow this pod survived. As to where you are, the answer is Lhasa.
He was already drained by this narrative.
Lhasa?
This room you smashed apart is my father's workshop.
Your father.
She lingered on the word as if it had triggered something within her, a memory. She disengaged and walked to the pod. Jake followed her. She checked the readings in the pod and realized that life support had gone offline. If this Terran didn't open the pod when he did, she would have suffocated.
I'm Jake, by the way. Again.
He said with an extended hand.
Oh, I'm introducing myself. It's a Terran custom. You should also tell me your name, then shake my head.
Why?
Then that means we're friends, acquainted.
She looked at his hand, then his face. She hesitated before stretching forth her hand. But instead of shaking his hand, she gripped his wrist. Jake assumed that this was how the Arez shook hands.
I am Adeola.
She reluctantly introduced herself.
Abiola?
No, Adeola.
We'll just call you Ad for now.
She gave him a disapproving glare. Adeola and Jake's stomachs growled at the same time.
Sounds like you're hungry. I'm starving too. All I had was half a plate of eggs for breakfast.
I am not hungry,
she replied. A moment later, her stomach growled again.
I do not require sustenance, but since I am here, I will try your food.
Sure. I'll go into town and score some grub. Just wait here, Adeola.
He felt cool just saying her name.
I will go with you.
Are you crazy? You can't just walk around outside.
I will not wait here to be ambushed.
I'm not... Fine.
Jake was flustered. He didn't know why he was going out of his way for this person he had just met, but he devised a plan. He looked around for something that would not draw attention. All he found was his father's work clothing. It was a navy blue hooded jumpsuit.
Okay, functional. This will have to do. Just be sure to keep the hood up and your head down,
he declared as he pulled it from a box.
Wow, it is ugly,
Adeola said resignedly as she snatched the work clothing away.
Is that any way to treat your ticket to the outside world?
You Terrans are difficult.
She stared at it for a while before putting it on. The hood fit her perfectly, concealing her alien features. Jake smiled in satisfaction.
Now we can get some pizza while we explore. Are you ready?
What is pizza?
Only the best food in the galaxy.
Jake walked to the door and slid it open. The bright daylight filled the workshop. Adeola walked up behind Jake. She stared at the city beyond the salvage yard, and her eyes portrayed wonder. This Lhasa was so different from Samael, so blue. Shangla LHS SAR-V 001976 upload dat. Chapter 7. The Walk. Jake nervously scanned the area outside the gates of his father's salvage yard. He adjusted his glasses with his index finger. After he verified that the coast was clear, he motioned with his hand for Adeola to follow him. As she boldly emerged from the gate, she stumbled and tripped into a parked motorized bike, fashioned after a Vespa that was near the entrance. Due to the narrow streets and walkways on the colony, these compact vehicles were the primary mode of transportation other than public transport. The vintage-styled vehicle fell over with a loud crash. Jake jumped out of his skin.
What are you doing?
He asked in a loud shriek.
I thought you were a trained warrior.
Adeola became visibly annoyed. Her eyes narrowed, and she said,
The gravity here does not feel right. My body, it feels too light.
She crouched to pick up the small motorbike. She stretched her full length with the bike at waist level, held by both hands. Jake's jaw dropped. Are all of the Arez this strong, or is Adeola some kind of super warrior? He thought. She struggled to set the bike back in place. With a shake of the head, Jake aided her by working the kickstand. Without a word, they started walking towards town.
You are gonna love Sebastian's. It's the best pizza in the galaxy.
You have tried all the pizza in the galaxy? That is quite a feat to achieve at such a young age.
Adeola looked at him in awe. Jake thought about correcting her assumption, but the look of admiration plastered on Adeola's face filled him with an unearned pride that he wanted to bask in a bit longer. So he just rolled with it and led the way. The streets weren't too busy around this time. There were clusters of people, but not enough to cause cautious movement. Lunch hour was over for the locals, so everyone was either back at their jobs or rounding up their errands. Students were still in school, eagerly waiting for the closing bell. They made it to Sebastian's shop without incident. A tsunami of relief washed over Jake. Jake held up both his hands with palms facing Adeola and said,
Just wait here between the shops. I'll be right back.
He noticed her disapproval.
Please?
After a little hesitation, she nodded and walked into the narrow alleyway between the two stores. Jake disappeared into Old Man Sebastian's pizza shop. For the first time since she woke up, Adeola was alone. She marveled at the strange architecture around her. Gently, she ran her fingers across the outer wall of the pizzeria to feel its texture. It looked and felt like brick, but something was unreal about it. Although it had the trappings of excellent workmanship, it didn't feel like it was made from the ground. She concluded it was created by something else, a synthetic amalgamation of materials that simulated natural elements. This was an achievement by itself. She wondered about these humans and their need to simulate things they couldn't have. Being alone felt weird for her. She had thought Jake's absence wouldn't make any difference. But it did. He had somehow grown on her in the brief time since their meeting. His quirky and soft disposition had somehow become a part of the air that enveloped her. Adeola's eyes wandered to a couple walking down the street a little distance away from her. The male was wearing a tight-fitting jacket over black corduroy pants, while the girl had on a puke green wife-beater and brown skirt. She paid particular attention to the way they laughed and held hands, the way they gravitated to one another like two planets in perfect synchrony. She watched the couple gracefully bump in and out of each other's personal space. Her attention was snapped back to the present by the cry of a baby. She searched with her eyes while maintaining a straight face. Her eyes locked in on a young mother in a narrow street across. Gingerly, the mother retrieved the child from its stroller and sang in gibberish. The scene brought a smile to Adeola's face. She watched the child cease its crying, due to its mother's comfort and playfulness. A sliver of sadness crept into her as she thought back to her family and planet. She was then confronted by an intrusive idea. Why is this place so familiar? These Terrans are the enemy, monsters. Why do they seem so similar to us?
Hey, Adeola?
Jake's voice resounded in her dark cocoon and pulled her into the now. Like a sleeper woken from a slumber, she stared wide-eyed at the large, flat box in his hands.
You all right?
He asked once more with searching eyes.
Yes, I am fine. That smell is incredible.
Jake laughed.
Wait till you try it. I wish I could taste pizza for the first time. This is going to be great, and I know the perfect place to eat it.
Springsteen Park was the place the big boys went. Its atmosphere was custom-built to impress and close open-ended relationships. A large number of the married population had proposed there. Jake imagined Adeola's reaction once she saw the greenery and rides that connected the happy theme spread all over the park. He would finally get to see the famous park with a girl, an alien. Underneath a large tree in Springsteen Park, Jake wolfed down his 2 slices pretty quickly. Adeola made sure to savor each bite. This may be the only time she would get to enjoy this Terran delicacy they called pizza. It was a flavor, unlike anything her world had to offer. Jake wiped some Arez sauce from the corner of his mouth with a napkin as he tapped his wrist 3 times to quick save to the Shangri-La Ghost server. Shangla LHSSRV 001976 upload.dat. Adeola had noticed Jake perform this gesture earlier and was curious. She pulled her attention away from 2 rotating solar rings in the distance.
What is this custom of tapping your wrist 3 times?
She asked with a raised brow.
Custom?
Jake adjusted his glasses as realization hit him.
Oh no, I was just updating.
He answered, half laughing at her ignorance.
Updating?
Yeah, to the Shangri-La Ghost server.
He noticed the puzzled look on her face wasn't disappearing, then remembered that Adeola was an alien from a completely different culture. For some reason, he felt very comfortable with her. This made him often forget that she wouldn't understand some things that he took for granted. This would take some explaining. He inched closer and showed her the device on his wrist.
Okay, this is a Navi. If I tap it once, I can access all kinds of information. There's a score of a library stored within the database. Information gathered from way before I was born.
With a quick tap, Jake brought up a small holographic projection of a rose. Adeola poked her finger through it.
This is nice, but this flower has no smell.
Jake shook his head with a wry smile.
Yeah, the smell and other aesthetics come when you're connected to the server. Anyway, tapping the Navi 3 times is a shortcut gesture to update to the Shangri-La Ghost server.
He double-tapped to open the Shangri-La welcome graphic. It was a dove flying upwards before disappearing into shimmering light.
Beautiful. Is this the magic trick?
Adeola said with an excited clap.
No, this isn't magic. I get it. It's because of the dove, right?
She nodded vigorously.
Yes. I have learned that your ancestors developed this crude but wonderful invention that makes creatures appear and disappear. Why only use beasts, though?
I'm glad you think magic is a wonderful invention. As to your question, I have no idea why they only use those 2 tricks. There are other extreme magicians who do more dangerous tricks. Check this out.
He said as he pulled up a video of a deadly escape from a straitjacket. He watched the light in her eyes and smiled at himself for accomplishing this much.
Terrans are all filed on the Shangri-La server at birth. We upload our memories to it through the Navi. That was why I was triple tapping intermittently. I wouldn't want to forget a day like this.
He looked off into the distance and pondered.
After our bodies die, if we lived a good and productive life, we continue existing in a paradise on the Shangri-La server.
What about your soul?
Jacob looked down at the bottom of his shoes.
No, your soul, your spirit. It is your link to your ancestors. It links you to God.
She leaned forward to place her hand on his chest over his heart. Jake's heart beat little faster when she touched him. He didn't understand the concept she spoke of. It didn't make any sense to him.
God? I don't get it. What's a god?
Adeola removed her hand from his heart and leaned her back against the tree. She looked to the sky as a warm smile grew on her face.
Mars is the creator of all things. He is the originator of all life, the being who watches over all with love and strength.
So the Arez believe in magic?
Jake asked while trying not to laugh. Adeola frowned.
This is not magic. You Terrans only believe in your machines.
No, science. How can this Mars create an entire universe from nothing?
He asked as he adjusted his glasses.
That's magic, pure and simple.
She looked at him, then folded her arms in front of her.
So where did the universe come from?
She asked. Without missing a beat, he replied.
Scientists have theorized that the universe was created by an explosion over 1 trillion years ago. Mankind crawled out of the primordial void, and here we are.
That is said. Your people, you believe life is an accident.
Jake was silent for a moment. He had no words to respond to her. He changed the subject slightly.
So, the Arez just disappear when they die? That's just being completely gone, isn't it? That's no different than floating into oblivion.
He stopped himself from fumbling for words any further. The thought of non-existence scared Jake to his very core. Adeola smiled.
Not gone. We go home. We go back to where we belong.
Jake sheepishly smiled back.
I'd like to believe in something that much.
You do. You have not seen your Shangri-La, but you believe in it.
She said as a matter of fact and grinned.
No, that's not the same as... There's proof that Shangri-La exists.
He paused. He wasn't the type to open up to anyone. Maybe he was afraid of other people getting too close to him. But Adeola was so open, so free. It only felt right to share with someone who gave of herself without hesitation. Plus, he needed to prove her wrong.
My mom, she lost her life she lost her body while giving birth to me. Without Shangri-La, she would just be gone.
Adeola looked away.
She sacrificed for you. Is very brave.
Jake felt that Adeola had more she wanted to say, but something stopped her. It was okay. She wasn't one to hold back what she thought or felt. When she was ready, she would share. In such a short amount of time, they were closer than when they had first met. It was almost as if they had always known each other. Shingla LHS SRV 0976 upload.dat. Chapter 8. A Leap of Faith. David and his group cut school early so they could go hang out at spots like nowhere. They were making a racket about the system and general nonsense when David suddenly stopped. The gang members followed his gaze to where Jake and Adeola were seated at the base of a tree.
Isn't that Takeda?
One of the gang members asked.
You don't have to ask where you see buttons.
David smirked.
Let's go over and say hi.
The group let out a ridiculous laugh and followed David's lead. Jake stiffened the moment he saw them out of the corner of his eye. He tried to get Adeola to move fast, but the girl wouldn't budge.
What is wrong with you?
Adeola asked in an annoyed tone.
This is bad. This is bad. We need to get out of here.
Why? This place is beautiful, and I am not done eating.
Please, Adeola. Leaving right now is the best option. Remember our deal? You're breaking it right now.
She looked at him for a moment and decided it must be serious if he was this rattled.
Fine.
Hurriedly, Jake picked his briefcase and tried to shuttle her across the shoulder of the little knoll they were on. They made it to a street with shops on either side. David appeared in front of them with a snarl pretending to be a smile.
Why are we in such a hurry, Buttons? Stay and play.
By now, the other members had closed off his escape from behind. They kept moving in until a tight circle was formed, with Jake and Adeola at its center.
Oh, hello, David.
Jake started with a stutter.
Fancy meeting you here. What a nice day.
I was surprised to see you. Don't tell me you cut class. The perfect Takeda cut in school?
The members laughed and booed at this piece of information.
It wasn't intentional. Look, I don't want any problems.
Are you saying I'm a problem? Because if you are, then we're gonna have a problem.
David said in an intimidating tone.
I never said you were a problem, but if you say so, then... Dave, can I just go?
You think you're so smart. You think I didn't catch on to what you just did.
Jake blinked a couple of times. His left hand was twitching violently. Adeola's head was slightly bowed while she tried to pull the sleeve of the shirt. David caught sight of her, and his curiosity went for a swim.
A girl? You actually got a girl to hang out with a loser like you?
David asked. One of his gang pulled off Adeola's hood. David and his group were shocked by what they witnessed beneath. Adeola soundly grabbed the boy by the arm, then threw him through a storefront window. She grabbed another gang member and lifted him from the ground with one hand. It was a panicked scene. She cocked back her fist to punch the helpless boy. Jake grabbed Adeola by the elbow.
Adeola, don't!
She looked at Jake, then came to her senses and dropped the boy. Her training and reflexes had taken over. If she had thrown that punch, that boy would have died. An ill feeling befell her. She gazed at her fist and lamented. I almost did it again, she thought. The members of David's schoolyard gang scattered. Nearby officers heard the commotion and rushed towards the scene. One of the gang pointed Adeola and Jake out to the officers. Adeola felt an insufficient tug on her arm. It was Jake attempting to pull her away with him.
What are you doing? Come on, we gotta get out of here.
Jake's feet were shuffling as he tried in vain to pull her along. Adeola came to her senses. She took off running, dragging Jake along until he finally got his feet under him. Station security was hot on their heels. David was frozen in shock as he watched them escape with station security giving chase. Jake had a good idea as he and Adeola ran away.
We need to get to nowhere.
Which way?
Hard left into this next alleyway.
They reached nowhere faster than Jake had anticipated. It was a dead end. Adeola fearfully glanced about.
How was this an escape route? We are corralled.
We need to jump straight up. Trust me, it'll work.
Jake remembered the story of the boy that floated away forever, and the chain of fear bounded him to the spot. He knew jumping from nowhere was their only salvation, yet he feared floating into nothingness.
What is wrong?
Adeola asked.
I can't make the jump. You should go. Just jump. Jump as high as you can, okay?
What are you talking about?
I can't. You're better off without me.
I do not understand. You are not coming?
Jake didn't hear her. He had already retreated into himself. He was floating in a dark corner of his mind, alone. Suddenly, his shoulder felt warm. He peeked outside of himself to find the source of this feeling. Adeola had placed her hand on his shoulder. She was searching for his eyes, which he had pointed firmly at the ground. Jake met her gaze, and that's when he noticed. Adeola was just as afraid as he was. He was her only connection to this strange place, and he was abandoning her here. He could never forgive himself if he hurt her like that.
I'm sorry. Never mind. Follow me.
Halt! Stop right there!
Shouted the approaching officers. They were closing in and would soon be on them.
Okay, we're doing this. Grab my hand and don't let go.
Said Jake with a determined grin.
Now!
Adeola grabbed Jake around the waist, and they jumped up. Her powerful legs did most of the work as they shot up into the air. They soared upwards. Jake felt the wind on his face as the clouds parted before them. He could finally see it. The cityscape on the opposite side of the colony. He looked at Adeola. She was smiling ear to ear and wide-eyed also. Their ascent slowed as their bodies gradually shifted to land on the other side of the colony that was now below them. They gently landed in the Irving district. They were still holding on to each other even after they landed. They stood there for what felt like a long time before Jake finally broke the silence.
That was...
Do not ruin this with your words.
Adeola let go of him, then inspected the area.
Just think of a plan.
Annabelle Takeda was working in her home office when her Navi beeped. It was a call from the school administrator placed in charge of Jake.
Sorry, Mrs. Takeda, but I have been saddled with the responsibility of informing you that your son wasn't in school today. This is part of a routine measure to ensure that the parents and school communication lines are open. We apologize for assuming your ward cut school, but since we were not contacted by you, it became imperative for us to inform you of what happened on our end. Thank you.
She placed her hands on her hips. What will I do with this boy? She tapped her Navi, but Jake's communicator was unresponsive. Without thinking too much, she grabbed her bag and keys and headed for the door. David was turning onto the street that led to Jake's house when he saw Annabelle leaving. Her countenance confirmed his fear. He had felt conflicted about what had transpired and had come to check if Jake had gotten home safely. But from the way he saw Mrs. Takeda leave, he knew all was not well. He didn't like Jake, but he also didn't want to cause irreversible harm to him. Deftly, he decided to tail Annabelle from a distance and come out of hiding if she needed help. The surprise that waited for Travis Takeda on reaching the salvage yard was beyond his imagination. The pride of his salvage collection lay open and empty. His workshop was in shambles. Was this a robbery? He ran to the office at the side of the large space and turned on the monitor connected to the security cameras he had installed after a break-in 2 years ago. The technology was outdated, but it did its work and remained undetected by the Spy System Act put in place by the station's security.
Who would rely on a bunch of incompetent people for security? Not you, Travis Takeda. Not you. Where are they now when my salvage yard has been looted?
He spoke at the portrait of himself on the opposite wall while shaking his head vehemently. The screen lighted up and he touched some buttons that took him to a few hours back. He kept fast-forwarding till he saw Jake enter his workshop. His breath caught when he saw what came out of the pod and he left without stopping the footage.
What have you gotten yourself into, Jake? What have you gotten yourself into? Your brother's gonna kill me for this.
Jake and Adeola stopped running and tried to catch their breaths. Jake felt as if his heart was ready to burst. He hadn't been this excited and terrified in all his life. Adeola straightened and took in long, deep breaths, then let them out in a measured fashion.
What do we do?
She asked hurriedly.
What?
I assume you had a plan.
I do. It just hasn't coalesced.
He replied. She gave him a look.
I'm still thinking, all right?
Can we get more pizza?
Adeola responded with a straight face.
What?
Pizza.
Right now? You seem not to comprehend the gravity of our situation.
Oh, I do. Trust me. But I cannot work on an empty stomach. I need sustenance.
Didn't we just eat?
We were not done. Your friends interrupted us.
Oh, they weren't my friends, okay?
Okay. You should have a plan by now.
He wanted to protest, but then he realized what she had been doing.
I sort of have a plan.
Let us hear it then.
We need to get you to my father. He has a ship. He can get you off to colony.
Sounds simple. How do we accomplish this?
I just rang him up on his private line and,
Jake tried to tap his Navi only to discover it was missing. Adeola noticed the confusion in his eyes.
What's happening?
I must have lost my device during the scuffle with David and station security.
And that means?
The plan's been ruined. We have no way to contact my father.
Can we find it?
We just flew across the station. It could be anywhere.
What do we do now?
I don't know, Adeola. Stay put until I figure something out?
That does not sound good. Water is corrupted unless it flows.
Lucky for us, we're only 70% water then.
She didn't smile at his attempt at a joke. On the surface of Lhasa colony, a small Arez space cruiser waited magnetized to the exterior. Beneath the craft, a circular incision was cut into the colony's exterior. A narrow airlock punctured through the opening like a mosquito's stinger. The ship was in low power mode and blended almost seamlessly with the metallic surface of the colony. A pilot sat inside of the ship, making preparations to depart once the infiltration team returned. He gazed at a round monitor, similar to a radar screen, and watched 3 blinking lights in the upper right hemisphere. The lights became smaller as the 3 warriors they represented got further away from the ship. Within the spherical space station, the 3 warriors from the Joffiel reconnaissance mission entered Travis Takeda's workshop. They had tracked the energy signature of the egg-like pod to this location. They searched for clues to determine where Adeola went. There was a noise outside the door. The lead warrior held up her fist. The other 2 snapped their gazes in her direction. She made quick hand signals, and her 2 subordinates quietly slinked into the surrounding shadows. She watched the door for a second before pulling a device from a pouch on her belt. The device fit onto her hand like brass knuckles. She pointed her fist upward, then a magnetic force pulled her to the ceiling above the open egg. A male voice could be heard on the other side of the door now.
Takeda, talk to me like I'm a chump. We'll see who's the chump.
An older gentleman wearing casual earth-tone clothing walked into the workshop.
Positive you can move these crystals?
He was talking into a device on his wrist. It was Sal, a member of Travis Takeda's salvage team. He was wearing a pair of black leather gloves and was obviously there on shady business.
Good. I'll meet you at the spot in an hour.
Sal tapped his Navi to end the transmission. His plan was a sound one. He was there to crack open the egg and swipe a few crystals. That idiot Travis wouldn't notice a few missing. Even though he was a blue-collar working man, Sal had a couple of underworld connections. People who could move a few stolen crystals on the black market. They didn't pay as much as the government, but Sal would still make a huge payday. He was well aware of Takeda's security setup, and he had the cameras on a loop. As Sal got closer to the egg, he noticed that something was amiss.
What's a void? It's open already?
He walked up to the pod and stood there in disbelief. Sal then made the worst mistake he's made in his adult life. He looked up. Perched on the ceiling looking down on him was the alien warrior. Before Sal could let out a scream, he felt a piercing pain. His eyes slowly looked away from the figure above him and down to his torso. A humming dark blade stuck out from his stomach. The warrior behind him pulled the sword from his body, and Sal dropped to his knees. He looked back up, and the room violently spun before everything went dark. His headless body fell to the floor as the warrior behind him sheathed her blade behind her back. The leader dropped down from the ceiling and pulled a scanning device from her belt. The other 2 warriors gathered closely behind her to view the scanner's readings over her shoulders. She spoke a few words in their shared language. The 2 nodded and made their way towards the door as she followed. The leader tossed a small capsule over her shoulder onto Sal's body as she walked away. His remains burst into blue flames and quickly burned to ashes, leaving a shadow-like outline on the floor. Chapter 9. Where the Threads Meet. Catherine Fisher was a petite woman in her mid-20s with reddish-brown hair. Her skin was pale with freckles dotting her slender face. The long gray skirt she wore cut abruptly at the ankle, while the matching jacket on her frame was neatly folded at the elbows. The hallway of the council building was busy with people, beeping, and chatter. As she made her way to Louis Johnston's office down the hall, several people greeted or threw a nod or 2 of familiarity her way. Some she ignored while acknowledging others. There was no way anyone could miss Louis's office, its sheer size being the major contributing factor. It was built to be the largest office on the floor and the building by extension, with large mahogany doors serving as the entrance. The windows were enormous with a beautiful view of downtown Lhasa near the lake. Catherine meekly tapped on Louis's open door. He had his door custom made, and it had this antiquated mechanism called a doorknob built onto it. The sight of this inefficient device always annoyed Catherine. Louis was behind a large ornamental desk that held 0 clutter. He held up a finger for her to wait by the door while he pretended to finish up some work on his datapad. His Navi then beeped, and he got on a call with someone Catherine could only vaguely take a stab at. His office chair resembled a throne and swiveled along with his movement. He was a handsome man in his early 40s who only wore the sharpest of suits on the station and had a contagious charisma. Louis Johnston was the senior director of the station security. His inadequacy for the job was the only ill air around this man, laughing boorishly. Catherine wondered how a man with such great fashion sense couldn't act coordinated or handle a sensitive job like security. She doubted every other story that spoke praise of this man. His inebriated sense of administration was the reason she was here instead of enjoying the periodical that came in her mail this morning. Catherine stood by the door until he was done with the call. Passively, he waved her in. She walked towards the seat in front of his desk, but he stopped her abruptly.
Cathy, could you do me a solid and whip me up a cup? Nobody makes it like you. Thanks.
He added, before she could utter objections. He had passive-aggressively thanked her in advance because he wasn't really asking. There was no use arguing with the bully behind the desk with a pretentious smile. For a moment, Catherine awkwardly stood in the middle of the office, clinging to her datapad.
Oh, okay.
She turned and walked towards the coffee machine in the back corner of the office. This wasn't part of her duties as the junior station security director. Catherine had the qualifications to do his job. Louis fired his personal assistant a month ago, and Catherine, in a bid to do a good deed, made him a cup of coffee. He liked the brew so much that somehow it became part of her many daily tasks. For a week she had been trying to work up the nerve to refuse his request, but today was another failure. She brought the full cup to his desk. It was light and very sweet. This was normally when Louis would bring up some random colony business to justify summoning Catherine into his office for his drink. But his datapad began to beep urgently. Catherine's pad also started beeping. Louis tapped on his device frantically.
What the void is a 009 code? I never heard of that one.
No big surprise there, Catherine thought. Before Louis could tap his Navi device to search for the answer, Catherine educated him.
Code 009 is Arez contact within the colony.
She tried to hide her annoyance when she spoke. Louis's perfectly tanned face went pale. He handed her the mug as he jumped up from his throne. He was clearly shaken by the news.
Cathy, pour that into a travel cup and follow me.
Where are we going?
To the governor's office.
His commanding voice was shaking like a leaf in fall.
Come on, don't dawdle.
They briskly walked across the municipal complex grounds towards the governor's office building. Louis flashed his credentials at the staff manning the front desk. He signed off on Catherine, accompanying him to the governor's floor at the top of the building. Catherine was a bit excited. Louis was very protective of his access to Governor Manning. They entered the lift, and Louis gestured for her to press the button for the top floor.
Listen, Cathy. Just follow my lead and be sharp. Wing anything you don't know. Don't make an ass of me in there. Are you going over all the details of the incident on your pad right now?
For once, Catherine wasn't on top of her duties. She was riding the awestruck wave. Louis leaped in front of her and grabbed her by the shoulders.
Listen, Cathy, this is the big leagues. I'm going to need you backing me up in there. Are you game or not? I need to know where your head is right now.
Catherine immediately started researching on her pad.
I'm game. I'm game, absolutely.
She said absent-mindedly. Her resolve made him smile. He let go of her shoulders, adjusted his expensive tie, and turned toward the lift doors.
Good. Okay.
He produced a black comb from his breast pocket and manicured his glorious head of hair as the lift doors opened. A long hallway swallowed them as they exited the elevator. There were only 2 doors on the floor. One led into the governor's office, and the other was his personal restroom.
It's showtime.
His voice trailed off. Louis opened the double doors that led to the office. It was an incredible sight to behold. 3 of the 4 long walls were lined with windows. The office was so high they could see the curvature of the landscape far off. Most of the station was visible from this vantage point. Arthur Manning's desk was massive, but it had to not look tiny in such a gigantic space. There was a large empty mug on his desk. Catherine could smell the coffee in the air, strong and heady.
Johnston, you better have a damn good explanation for how a Red got into my colony.
Manning's deep voice echoed throughout the room. He was an older, fatherly-looking man. He had to be in his mid to late 50s. His presence permeated the room.
Arthur, I heard you knocked a couple of swings off your game recently,
Louis said and offered a sheepish smile.
That's Governor Manning to you, Director of Station Security. I want answers right now.
Arthur replied curtly. Louis saw his plan to play up to the governor was unraveling at the seam. The sweat was pouring by the buckets on his face. He decided to sink or swim. Catherine had to save him.
Hey, of course, answers. Catherine, enlighten the governor on our findings.
Catherine's heart did a cartwheel. She realized why Johnston brought her along. There was very little information on the incident, and no leads as to where the Arez invader had gone. Johnston invited her along to take the bullet for him. Her voice trembled as she delivered the bad news. Lack of news.
Why is she even here?
Manning yelled.
Sir, I believe in cultivating a strong team by giving them responsibilities. I trust my team, and in this one instance, it backfired. She wasn't ready, and I take total responsibility for that. This is a team failure, sir. Kathy, would you mind waiting in the hall, please?
The first Arez attack in 80 years on my colony. This could ruin everything I've worked for.
I assure you, we won't rest until the invader is contained, sir.
Catherine was mortified. It took an eternity for her to cross the ridiculously large office back to the door. She closed the large door behind her and pressed her forehead against it. She was shaking. That was humiliating, she thought. Can my career even recover from this? The anger was gradually rising within her. Bile rose in her throat and her face contorted. She was tempted to punch something, anything. Slamming her fist on the door could serve a therapeutic function, but she stopped herself. She had to fight back, but how? Catherine looked down the hall to the solitary bathroom door. 20 minutes later, Johnston emerged from the office. He pulled out his comb to repair his glorious hair. He looked side to side down the long hallway.
Kathy? Guess you headed back to the office.
He entered the lift. Moments later, Arthur Manning exited his office and power walked down the hall to his private restroom. He flung the door open and dashed to the urinal. As he relieved himself, the door to the toilet stall slowly and quietly opened. After he was done with his business, he turned around to find Catherine standing there. Without missing a beat, he asked,
What are you doing here? You have 5 seconds before I call security.
Wait. I have a way to quietly find the invader.
How?
Catherine reached past the governor and swiped her hand over the faucet. Water began to pour out. Manning turned and began washing his hands.
I'm listening.
He said loud enough for her to hear over the sound of running water.
Yes. There was a project called Liberty Shield. It was a seizure project. I worked on it.
Hold on. You're a scientist? What are you doing in politics?
Manning asked while waving his wet hands under a device on the wall. A light flashed and his hands instantly dried.
Who invented that hand dryer?
Catherine asked. Manning folded his arms, stared her down, and didn't pretend to think about it.
Exactly. There's no recognition in science, but politics. Politics are a different beast altogether.
So, what's this Liberty Shield thing you speak of?
Catherine clutched her datapad to her chest and continued.
It was an R&D project that can help us accomplish this thing in half the time. It was designed to grant backdoor access to all the frames on the colony. We could even override a frame and use it to apprehend the intruder.
Doesn't exactly sound legal.
The program was scrapped before it was put into action. The people on the board felt it was unconstitutional. We were only trying to make a doomsday protocol and save lives. We were ahead of our time.
She had piqued Manning's interest. He respected ambition.
What do you need to get it up and running?
Access to the station mainframe.
And what do you want?
Catherine was taken aback. She had never openly put her cards on the table before. No one ever asked her what she wanted.
I want Louis Johnston's job.
She blurted out.
You don't want that clown's position. He's been stuck in that department for 15 years. He's not going anywhere.
Catherine's nerves were starting to get to her. She was angry when she left the office. Now that her anger was fading, so was her resolve.
I'll tell you what. You pull this off, and I'll give you a junior position in my cabinet. You want to be a politician? You'll get to see a real one up close,
he said with a smile.
That doesn't sound like a promotion.
Unlike Johnston, I invest in potential. You learn enough to become a future ally, or you work for me indefinitely, and I have a scientific mind on tap.
Manning rubbed his brow with his fingers.
You handle this quietly. I don't want any agitation. This situation is too close to the elections, and I don't want anyone questioning my competence because of some life forms that decide to show up after 80 years of silence. Is this clear? I trust your discretion on this,
he said with a look that demanded obedience. Manning reached into his jacket and handed her an access card. Catherine attempted to take the card, but he was holding it too tightly.
If you fail, you stole this card from my pocket. It's all on you. All of it.
He held her gaze. Catherine silently nodded and took the card.
That fool Johnston. He had a scientist fetching him coffee. Such a shame,
Arthur said as he shook his head.
See you around, Kathy.
Catherine, sir. Catherine.
She awkwardly blurted out.
All right, Catherine. Impress me.
Manning smiled and left the room. Catherine took a few minutes to compose herself. This was the big leagues, the deep end. It was to win or to die from this point forward. She cursed Johnston for pushing her this far past the edge. Chapter 10. Confrontation. The Irving district was booming economically during the long years of the conflict. Its many factories produced munitions for the battleships that sailed through the cosmos, waging war against the dreaded Arez Armada. But when the fighting stopped 80 years ago, so did the prosperity of the district. The factories closed, and the most skilled laborers left the district or the colony entirely. Those who couldn't leave fell into despair and poverty. The Irving district was now a hopeless, crime-ridden area full of desperate people trying to get by any way they could. It was a dangerous place for outsiders, especially for a naive boy and an alien, unfamiliar with her surroundings and local customs. Jake and Adeola were walking down a partially lit street.
Are we going the correct way?
Adeola scanned the environment as she asked.
Yeah.
You do not sound sure.
I'm pretty sure this is the right way.
She grabbed him by the shoulder and spun him around.
Pretty sure is not sure.
Jake shrugged.
Listen, the space colony's a globe. If we walk straight, we're bound to wind up in the right place.
Adeola folded her arms and pinched the bridge of her nose.
By Mars, I thought you were smart.
Hey!
A shady-looking man called from across the street.
We should go.
Adeola checked to make sure her hood was still pulled over her head.
Hey! You don't recognize me? Breaks my heart you don't recognize your old pal.
I think you have me confused with someone else,
Jake replied. A group of young men approached and blocked their path. The shady-looking young man joined this crowd.
Nah, it's definitely you. So, you got them credits I lent you?
Asked the young man. He had the air of a leader. Jake was finally catching on. This group must have seen his school uniform and assumed that he was well off. There weren't many private schools in the area. A burly fellow walked up and stood next to the slender young man.
Look.
Jake stammered.
Is there any way you will just let us through?
I'll tell you what. Just pay me back what you owe, and I'll let you walk. Even after you disrespected me in front of all of our friends. I'm forgiving like that.
Jake stared.
Man, seems like we gotta teach you a lesson in manners, kid.
At the leader's signal, some of the gang members rushed at them. Adeola pushed Jake aside and kicked two out of the path. She wrapped her palm around the fist of another man and twisted his arm out of joint, then quickly ducked as another swung a metal pipe at her. Deftly, she threw a kick that connected at his ankles and then punched him to the ground. She could feel his jaw break against her knuckles.
Ha! You think you're some hot stuff? Get him!
Yelled the leader. More of them made a mad dash for Adeola. Jake watched in amazement. His left hand was twitching as his fear and awe grew. Part of him wanted to get into the fray and help her out, while the other part was scared of getting hurt. He stood fixed to the spot and willed his entire being to man up. He slapped himself squarely in the face. He slapped himself again. His feet moved and took him to where the action was happening. He got the wind knocked out of him as soon as he got close to the fight. The leader who knocked Jake down was standing over him. Jake quickly got back up only to get knocked down again. He spat blood and his organs felt like they had been on fire. His sight became blurry. He struggled back to his feet again. His assailant charged in once more. Jake finally noticed that the man attacked him the same way each time. Steps forward with the left leg, then throws a right punch straight, Jake thought. The man stepped forward with his left leg, but this time Jake ducked beneath his punch. He had a clear line of sight to the man's jaw and thrust his fist upwards. Jake connected with the man's jaw and knocked him back a foot or two. Jake's left hand was throbbing. He never landed a punch before. He imitated Adeola's fighting stance as best as he could.
You want some more?
The leader put up his hands. Jake looked surprised. Was his punch so powerful that he knocked the will to fight out of this man?
Hey, look. Can we call this a truce?
Pride swelled in his chest. He lowered his fists and accepted the olive branch.
Yeah. Just grab your friends and get out of here.
Sure thing, kid.
The shady young man was looking past Jake. Jake turned around to see Adeola standing there. All of the gang members were laid out at her feet. Arms were broken, eyes were swollen shut, and teeth littered the ground. She looked upset, sad. Jake took Adeola by the hand and pulled her away from the carnage. They got 2 blocks away before stopping. He placed his hands on Adeola's shoulders.
Ad, are you okay?
She didn't answer.
Please, talk to me. What's wrong?
She leaned back against a wall. Her eyes were tearing up.
All I am good at is hurting people,
she whispered. Jake struggled to understand her. He'd always been afraid to fight. Her strength just gave him the confidence to finally stand up for himself. How could that be a bad thing? But it wasn't important for him to pick apart why she was upset. He just had to be there for her.
You want to talk about it?
It took her a moment.
I ran away from home.
Jake offered his left hand to her. His hand was still slightly trembling from the confrontation before. As she took his hand, he felt that her hand was also trembling.
In our 15th summer, we undergo the trials.
A tear rolled down Adeola's cheek.
The final trial is ritual combat, and I hurt someone. I hurt her so badly that she may never be the same. Everyone, they praised me for it. They were so proud of me.
Jake was surprised to learn that she was actually younger than he was.
It's okay.
The tears were freely flowing down her face at this point.
I don't want to hurt people anymore.
She was squeezing Jake's hand so hard that it hurt, but he endured.
I'm here.
My mother, she was the only one who understood me, but she's gone now.
This wasn't one of his puzzles that had a clear solution in the end. This was someone he cared about, who had real problems that he couldn't solve with all of his logic, no matter how much he wanted to.
Thank you.
He looked down.
I didn't do anything. Nothing useful anyway.
Adeola placed her left hand on his bleeding cheek and then touched his forehead with hers.
This is a sign of affection on Samael.
Their eyes closed, and their breathing went one into the other. Both hearts slowed down and synchronized to the language that breaks all barriers.
Does this mean what I think it does?
Silence.
Okay.
They both laughed. Jake placed his left hand on her cheek and pulled her in till the tips of their noses touched. Elsewhere, Travis Takeda was fiddling with a soldering iron and gadgets in a room full of junk. The drone of an old cooling unit was the only source of air in the tightly packed room. His forehead was a pool of salt mixed with water, and his concentration was zen-like. Beside him was a piece of the pod with wires running to and from it. He had a holographic screen lit up in front of him as he went to work with the soldering iron. He flipped a switch, and a small red dot lit on his Navi. His Navi then beeped. The caller ID displayed Annabelle Takeda. Travis let it ring for a while before turning it to silent mode. The last thing he needed was to get in a fight with Anne. He knew he had no excuse to feed her. Finding their son was paramount. Anything else was secondary. Annabelle would skin him alive if she found out he was responsible, albeit indirectly, for Jake's skirmish with the authorities. It was a good thing he found a way to track the Arez girl through the technology lined in her flight suit, which she wore beneath her disguise.
I finally tracked you down, Jake. You will not be the cause of my death.
Who would have known that he had the ingenuity to craft things that could save his life and marriage?
What are you doing all the way out there? It's dangerous. Please be all right, kid. Please be all right.
He broke into a run at the thought of things that may go wrong. Chapter 11. Things Fall Apart. Catherine Fisher had commandeered an unregistered datapad from storage. She used an ex-employee's credentials to acquire the pad. Lewis Johnston was the only person who was supposed to have access to departmental credentials. But due to his laziness, he gave Catherine all of his authorization codes, allowing her full access to the system. This way, she could do his job more efficiently. If things went south, Louis would be the one they came after first. Serves the pig right, she thought. She finished uploading the Liberty Shield algorithm to the colony mainframe. She took a deep breath until her complexion went slightly pink. Her finger hovered over the activation icon for what felt like hours. She weighed the consequences of her action. It was true that she had been bitter when the project was canceled while they were perfecting it. It felt foolish and almost comical to think that what they were trying to prevent was here to bite them on the behind. She threw all the flying thoughts away and pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. Then instantly her small office was filled with blue holographic images. She stood and walked to the center of the room while clutching the datapad to her chest. Every frame on the colony was lending her their eyes and, if she so desired, at her command. Finally, she was seeing Liberty Shield in action. It was beautiful. Things were starting to go her way. She finally got to use the system that she worked so hard on. She was on the verge of getting a better job and a mentor, and no matter how things went, she would never have to set foot in this office again. Her face grew determined as she scanned the floating first-person images.
All right, where are you hiding, alien?
Anne Takeda was frantically searching the streets for her son, while David Assad followed from a distance, unnoticed. Anne had stormed out of the house to look for Jake before thinking it over first. It would have made far more sense to wait for the little delinquent to come home, to catch him by surprise once he set his school bag down. She had already committed to her search plan, so there was no turning back now. Contrary to her belief, Anne was a particularly stubborn person once she set her mind to something, and that son of hers had been working her nerves lately. His constant passive-aggressive challenges to her authority within the house were infuriating, and he could be intolerable. Anne loved her son, but she had trouble liking him at times. It was difficult to find a teen playing hooky on a space colony. Where do the kids even hang out these days, she thought. It had been so long since she was that age, and even back then she was far more conservative and responsible than her peers. The other kids used to call her ma'am in jest. She had already checked the shopping district near the Bowie Academy campus grounds. There was a store there that sold the puzzles that Jake was so fond of. The clerk didn't recall seeing him that day. She was wandering at this point with no leads. Since Travis was not answering his Navi, she decided to venture towards his salvage yard to enlist his help with the search.
Annie?
A voice called out to her. She turned around to see that it was Edna Fong, proprietor of a local diner. Edna, how are you?
I'm fine. Is everything okay? I just saw that boy of yours.
Really? Where did you see him?
He just came in and bought a plate, not 10 minutes ago. He looked hurt.
Edna replied. Which way did he go?
He went off towards Chelsea. Yeah, Chelsea.
Edna explained.
I tried to stop him, get him some help, but he wouldn't have it. The best I could do was give him a first aid kit.
Why didn't you reach me?
I was trying. I couldn't find your frequency.
I'm sorry, Edna. I'm just worried. Anne looked down the street.
Anytime. Please let me know when you find him. And if he's okay?
Thank you for your help. Anne quickly walked away. She began this quest to find her errant child with the sole purpose of scolding him. Now a new mystery was afoot. What had that fool boy gotten himself into? For all of his intelligence, he was severely lacking in common sense. If he was hurt, why was he roaming the streets? she spotted a drop of blood on the ground on a moderately crowded street. Further away was another drop, a trail. The trail led her to a quieter block and into an alley. As she crept into the alley, she heard voices speaking barely above a whisper.
Yeah, it's good, right?
A boy's voice asked. A female voice replied to him, but Anne couldn't understand her. Whatever she was speaking, it wasn't Terran.
Oh, it's called risotto del carne.
It was definitely Jake speaking to the mysterious girl.
How did you break the fork?
The unintelligible girl's voice replied once more, and the two laughed together.
It's plastic. You don't have plastic on San Miguel?
Jake giggled. The red girl smiled and replied in what sounded like Arez. Jake and Adeola were closely sitting on the ground together. Jake was covered in bandages, and Adeola had visible bruises on her hands. Annabelle stepped into their view and confronted them. "Get away from my son," Anne screamed. Adeola dropped her plate, leaped to her feet in front of Jake, and crouched into an aggressive stance upon seeing the metallic woman. Frightened, Anne stumbled and fell back against a wall behind her. Adeola was screaming at Anne and Arez when Jake cut between the two. He faced Adeola and placed his hands on her shoulders.
Ad, calm down. That's my mom.
Adeola looked at Jake and then back to the metal woman, then to Jake again. She stared for a moment before saying,
Your mother is a machine?
I told you that already.
No, you did not.
Yeah, I did.
Actually, yes. But it is still strange.
Jake deeply looked Adeola in the eyes.
Ed, relax. You're freaking her out.
What is freaking out?
Sorry. You're scaring my mom. Please?
Adeola relaxed her stance and took a step back. Jake walked towards his mother. Anne grabbed Jake and pulled him close. Jake, what happened? Did she hurt you?
No. Mom, she's a friend.
Did you hit your head? She's an Arez. They're dangerous.
She's not dangerous.
You don't know about these things. Anne exclaimed in an angered whisper.
I know enough.
No, you don't. Adeola's earpiece had a peer-to-peer connection to Jake's Navi. She couldn't understand Annabelle's words, but she could understand her intent, the fear in her voice. Adeola moved away and sat with her knees pulled up. She wrapped her arms around her legs as she looked at Jake and Anne. You're coming with me and we are calling station security. Anne snapped.
You never listen. This is why Pop never comes home.
Jake got angry and lashed out. He immediately knew that he went too far.
I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean that.
As soon as he said it, he regretted it. Yes, you did mean it, she said sadly. Anne was deeply wounded by his words. In her tiny locked office at the municipal plaza, Catherine's eyes were burning as she examined the small holographic images floating around her. It had been some time since she last blinked. She felt like she was drowning in an ocean of images and information. The task was proving to be far more difficult than she had imagined when she made Author the promise. There was too much information for her to sort through all at once. It would take a longer time for her to analyze, categorize, assimilate, then map out a pattern. It would take time she did not have because she remembered his warning. Then there was the fear of screwing things up. This was the break she had been wishing for every morning in front of the mirror. She would be damned if anything would make a puddle out of these fine ingredients. Out of the corner of her eye, a dozen or so screens quickly passed. With a flick of an index finger and a supporting thumb, she paused the carousel. Catherine saw her, the Red Invader, her ticket to a better life. Adrenaline-level excitement coursed through her veins and her lips parted in a sneer. She strummed her fingers on the datapad like a professional pianist rendering a concerto of the great masters. The image enlarged to the size of her south wall as the other screens blinked out of existence. Finally, Catherine was face to face with her prey. She felt like a tiger. She breathed out a sigh of relief and allowed herself a few blinks as a reward for her diligence. Scrunching up her nose, she asked herself,
What's this kid doing with the intruder?
She scanned his face, then cross-referenced it against the colony population database.
Jacob Takeda.
She accessed the frame's registration information to determine its occupant.
Annabelle Takeda?
It dawned on Catherine that this was a worried mother who had found her son. Her eyes went out of focus for a moment and she thought of her own parents. It had been so long since she set eyes on them. It wasn't for lack of trying on their part. She was too busy doing all of the work assigned to her by an incompetent boss. No, That wasn't the reason she avoided her parents. It was a lie she had told herself for so long that she believed it. She looked around her tiny office and accepted the real reason. The truth was, she was too ashamed to face them, to tell them how much she hated her job and all of the people she worked with. She couldn't face them until she became everything they saw in her. She desperately needed to exorcise this feeling of failure lingering in her lungs. She shook her head and got out of her reverie. Quickly, she tapped on the virtual keys on her datapad and began to preload the sequence for the Sentinel protocol. Jake, you know you're the most important person in the world to me. Why do you make... Anne's voice suddenly cut off and her eyes went dark like a starless sky.
Mom?
She stood motionless. Then the lights behind her lids started to blink erratically. There was a whirring sound coming from her body.
Mom, if this is a joke, please stop it.
Jake asked fearfully. Her eyes went red instead of the normal blue once the blinking stopped. Adeola stood and approached them.
Jake, I think something is wrong with your mother.
Nothing's wrong with her.
Although he said those words, there was zero conviction in his heart. Something within told him this wasn't normal. And Takeda started to mutter computer command codes in a robotic voice. Args Niyursakigiers override. Class if Genesis or Max, then. Switch to Corelli system. Libra Shield ESQ, unload hidden mantra Gen 219. Undo string 6 val 2.05. Anne violently shoved Jake out of her way and he crashed into a nearby wall. She charged straight for Adeola while muttering the codes. Adeola was caught off guard. She rolled out of the way to avoid Anne's attack. Adeola was on her feet when Anne circled back for another blow. She didn't want to hurt Jake's mother. Her only option was to keep dodging all the strikes, now coming with more force and speed. Anne punched Adeola, then spun around and kicked her squarely in the stomach. The shock ran through Adeola's core and she felt blood in her mouth. Before she could recover, Anne kicked her again in the side, sending her straight into a wall. Adeola let out a painful cry that drowned out Jake's call to his mother. Swiftly, Anne was on Adeola with punches until she went limp.
That's not supposed to happen,
Catherine said while feverishly plucking away at the datapad. She was preloading the Sentinel mode subroutine into Liberty Shield, but it activated on its own. Liberty Shield was dismantled before the extended testing phase. She had hoped everything would go glitch-free, but this turn of events was making her queasy. There was no way she could have anticipated this glitch.
This isn't on me. This isn't on me.
She kept repeating like a mantra. The more she said it, the more guilt she felt. There was no turning back now. The red girl had to be captured at all costs. Her future depended on it. Chapter 12. Something to Protect. Adeola grunted with every punch and kick that Anne connected. Her face was already swollen from the beatdown. Blood was pouring from her nose like a broken faucet. Jake tried to sit up.
Adeola, fight back. Why aren't you defending yourself?
The pain bit at the edges of his nerves, but the pain escaping from Adeola's lips hurt him even more.
No,
Jake said meekly. He watched his mother as she assaulted Adeola relentlessly. He remembered Adeola's words from earlier. She had enough and she wasn't going to fight anymore, not even to defend herself. She needed his help. He needed to help her, but he was frozen in fear. His left hand was shaking uncontrollably. Anne reeled back her fist and readied a finishing blow. Adeola watched her. It was like the scene was playing out in slow motion. She was in so much pain, not just from the fight, but in her soul. She had spent her entire life fighting, training herself into a weapon. She didn't even know why she trained so vigorously. Was it because she was told to? Perhaps her fight was over. She exhaled. She was ready. The powerful punch was nearing her face. Jake jumped in front of Adeola and took the blow for her. The strike impacted his left shoulder and dislocated it. He fell into Adeola and knocked them both to the ground. Anne froze momentarily. It was as if her consciousness was fighting the Liberty Shield override. This delay granted Jake and Adeola a brief reprieve. Adeola crawled to Jake as he lay on the ground. She pulled him into her arms and cradled him.
Why would you do that? You could have died.
Jake reached out and touched her swollen face with his left hand.
Yeah, I was willing to risk it.
He looked her in the eyes.
And I would do it again.
Adeola began to cry.
That was foolish of you.
Fight, Adeola. Protect yourself. I promised to get you home. I can't do that if...
Just stay here,
she said as she gently set him down. She realized that Jake was also in danger. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for both of them. Adeola stood and faced Anne. Anne's eyes shined red once more. She snapped her gaze onto Adeola, then charged forward and threw a roundhouse kick. The kick met with Adeola's arms crossed in defense. She pushed Anne back and landed a punch straight to her abdomen, followed by consecutive punches to the head. Anne threw another punch, which Adeola caught at the wrist. She spun her hip into Anne's midsection, knocking her off balance, and then used that momentum to flip the humanoid machine over her shoulder and onto the ground. Adeola stood over the machine with her arms outstretched and let out an Arez battle cry. Within her small office, Catherine's eyes went wide in worry. She was looking forward to a swift wrap-up of the battle, but that petulant Jake Takeda had to keep urging the alien to fight back. The advantage was lost, and she didn't see any way to regain the upper hand. Her brain went through several scenarios and choices that could turn this battle in her favor. None of them seemed feasible, except for one. Releasing the frame's limiters could turn the tide, albeit at the cost of the frame. But that was a small price to pay compared to what she was trying to achieve, she thought. She quickly rolled some knobs on the translucent screen that appeared before her. A warning dialogue flashed a few times, but she silenced it with a flick of her wrist, then turned the knobs to their maximum. The screen flashed deep red, and the system requested confirmation.
Yes, I have considered every possible permutation, and I take full responsibility.
Within the alleyway, Annabelle's frame lay dormant on the ground for a few moments. Adeola relaxed her muscles and let out a breath of relief. She ached all over. She looked at Jake, and he gave her a thumbs up. She didn't understand the gesture, but assumed it was positive due to the half-smile on his face. As Adeola attempted to return the gesture, she felt a tight grip on her ankle, painfully tight. She then felt weightless. An unknown force had yanked her into the air. Then suddenly she came crashing back down to the ground. Adeola was in a state of vertigo as Anne swung her around by the ankle. The frame was using Adeola like a club and smashing the pavement and walls of the alley with her body. She felt her bones cracking as she repeatedly impacted against various surfaces. She caught a glimpse of Jake as she was hurtling back downwards. He had a terrified look on his face as he struggled to get to his feet. Adeola collided with the alley floor, sending shattered pieces of the ground upward. She bounced off her side, then was kicked in her midsection and sent flying into the far wall. She coughed up dark red, almost black blood. She was dazed, struggling to remain conscious. Every inch of her body was screaming in pain as she slowly slid down the broken wall. The frame appeared before her. Steam was billowing from its joints and its eyes were brightly glowing red. It grabbed Adeola around the neck and pinned her to the wall. Its hands were as hot as a skillet on a stove. If Adeola had weak skin like a Terran, it would be scarred. The machine tightened its grip. She was too weak to pry its hands from her neck. The security communicator beside Catherine came alive with chatter. Armed security forces were on their way, and it became imperative for her to do away with Adeola before they arrived. The commotion had somehow got their attention, and they would soon be on the scene.
What pest?
She swore under her breath. Travis Takeda was running with all he had. He sharply took a right turn, only to stop near his son. Jake struggled to see who was behind him. He knew the answer before Travis spoke.
Huh, Pop, please, save Adeola before Mob kills her.
Your mother? What happened? Who's Adeola?
Pop, there's no time. You have to.
What are...
The sound of flesh meeting metal from down the alley provided an answer before he could ask the question. Confused, Travis looked around, touched the bridge of his nose with his index finger, then ran toward the source of the sound. What he witnessed caused his breathing to come in shallow scoops. Anne, with missing parts, had Adeola pinned to the wall. Both women were shrieking like beasts.
Anne, what are you doing?
He called out. There was no response to his call. He tried again, but still no response. He ran to the fighting duo and tried to reason with his defunct wife. The color of her eyes made him hesitate for a second. It was then that he understood what Jake was saying. Something was different with the frame in front of him. The usual demeanor of the woman he married was missing, and in its place was a cold, mechanical, ferocious nature that he had never seen. Lines of indiscernible gibberish were running the width of her pupils.
Anne!
He screamed when he was close enough. She stopped and gazed without recognizing him. Her eyes were back to pitch black, and the smoke had intensified. It was now coming from every joint in her body.
Leave the girl alone, Anne. I know you can hear me. Please, come back. This isn't you.
He inched closer to her as he spoke with outstretched arms. The codes began to run on her pupils once again, and the frame went back to choking Adeola. Must kill. Kill. Travis wrapped his arms around Anne's waist. With all of his strength, he tried to pull her off of Adeola. His chest burned from the heat that the frame produced. Sparks were flying from its joints. Suddenly, the frame fell back full force on top of him. A few feet away, Anne's severed robotic arms dropped from Adeola's neck as the red girl fell to the ground unconscious. Travis was pinned beneath Anne's body. His chest pressed to her back. He then felt a piercing sensation in his sternum. The sensation graduated into an intense pain he felt all the way to his spine. Jake witnessed the scene in horror. One of the Arez warriors from the infiltration squad was crouched over his parents with her sword piercing through both of them. She had removed Anne's arms with a single sword stroke. The warrior stood as she pulled the blade from the bodies of both his parents. Jake wanted to scream, but his strength wasn't available. He felt the world beneath him go out of kilter as he saw the light fading from his father's eyes. He looked at the masked warrior standing over his parents' bodies, and she looked back at him. Anne stood back up. A second warrior sliced her robotic body to pieces. The first warrior broke her gaze with Jake and collected Adeola, while the second stood guard. In a language Jake believed to be Arez, one of the warriors said,
"Princess, what have they done to you?"
Jake could hear this because he was still connected to Adeola.
Princess?
Station security arrived with their weapons at the ready. The second warrior threw a small egg-shaped device onto the ground at her feet. A purple energy shield expanded in front of her. She pulled a laser pistol from her hip and opened fire at the officers. Her shots went through the shield, but the officers' bullets were deflected by it. Arez weaponry was on par with the technology produced by the Terrans, because they had a near-infinite power source in the crystals. A crystal the size of a potato could power a space station for years. Terrans had the potential to build energy shields and laser guns, but lacked the resources to create something small enough to fit into a belt holster as the Arez warriors had. A Terran shield generator would need to be the size of a bus, while a laser gun would be as large as a car. The first warrior escaped with Adeola in her arms. A third warrior was perched on the rooftop above the scene. She fired her laser rifle down into the crowd of officers. An explosion erupted, and the number of officers was greatly reduced. The energy shield finally dissipated, but the officers needed to reload. As they frantically tried to get their weapons fed and ready for action, the second warrior dashed toward the officers. She pulled her sword from her scabbard and skillfully slashed at them. Jake's left hand was trembling uncontrollably. He was horrified, but somehow he got to his feet. His body moved on its own. The Arez warrior killed several officers before Jake reached her. He leaped from the alley floor and grabbed her around the waist. She was caught off guard. She was so preoccupied with the officers that she didn't sense his approach. She changed her grip on her sword and prepared to run him through, but hesitated. She gazed at him for a moment, contemplating her next action. A stray bullet went through the side of her neck and she dropped the sword. She fell face first while clutching her wound. Her charge blade clanked as it impacted the ground. The third warrior finished off the remaining officers while rappelling down the side of the building. She threw a small, cube-shaped device onto the ground. An intense flash of light blinded Jake momentarily. When his sight returned, both warriors were gone. The charge blade that the warrior utilized to cut down the officers was left behind, on the ground. Jake's adrenaline stopped pumping, and he felt the pain in his shoulder. He stared at his father's remains and the pieces of his mother's frame strewn about the alley. Chapter 13. Humanity. David stood near the entrance of the alley. He had heard the gunfire, the screams, then everything went silent, painfully silent. None of the officers who entered the alley had returned. They were all dead. His knees were shaking. He couldn't move from the spot he stood upon. He took deep breaths to calm himself before he carefully poked his head beyond the corner of the building. David saw the bodies of the officers littering the ground. Whoever was responsible for this scene of carnage appeared to be gone. He entered the alley fully. He scanned the area carefully with his eyes. Further down, he could see a body clad in a school uniform that matched the one he was wearing.
Buttons?
He deliberately walked between the officers' bodies. It felt disrespectful to step over them. These men and women had just sacrificed their lives defending the colony. He slowly made his way toward Jacob. As he drew closer, he noticed Jake was clutching something in his right hand. It looked to be a weapon of some sort. A sword, he thought? He was close enough to see Jake's face. Jake wasn't unconscious. He was looking at something. David followed Jake's line of sight further down the alley. Jake was staring at his father's body. David noticed the dried tears on Jake's face. The boy was in shock. David summoned his courage and marched down the alley while removing his school blazer. He stood over Travis Takeda's body for a moment before respectfully placing his jacket over him. He walked over to Jake. As David approached, Jake sat up and pointed the charge blade in his direction. Jake's eyes were wide and crazed. David took a step forward. Jake swung the sword wildly in the space between them. David jumped back like a cat on its last life.
Whoa!
He yelled, half afraid of getting cut in half by the sword the grief-stricken Jake was wielding.
Hey, Buttons. It's me. We're classmates, remember? Drop the shank.
David cautiously approached. Jake stood up and lunged at him with the sword. David backed up fast.
Jake, snap out of it.
Jake stopped for a moment, and his eyes lost their daze. Gradually, he came back to the present, and recognition flooded his face.
Assad?
Jake asked through the cloud of confusion covering him. He gazed at the sword in his grasp.
Why am I... What's going on?
His arm that was holding on to the sword went limp as he slumped against the wall behind him for support.
I thought you hated me. What are you doing here?
You think I'm some kind of psychopath?
David was bothered by the question.
Busting your chops is one thing, but this... only an animal would.
Busting my chops?
Jake interrupted him. He laughed to himself as his right arm tensed.
You made the last month of my life impossible. That's what you call busting my chops?
Jake stopped laughing and pulled the trigger on the hilt of the charge blade. It hummed with an ominous sound.
Why shouldn't I end you right now?
Jake looked him in the eye.
Give me one good reason not to bust your chops right now. Go ahead. Give me one reason why I should let you walk out of here.
David could see that Jake was still in shock.
So, you a killer now?
David stammered. He was nervous and scared. He was trying not to get cut by the strange weapon Jake pointed at him. He held his hands above his head, palms out.
Don't do anything crazy.
Why are you here?
Jake asked while pointing the sword. His arm was shaking.
What went down earlier by the park? Wasn't right. Just trying to make it right.
His voice trailed off and he coughed a few times. His gaze was turned to the end of the alley while looking at Jake out of the corner of his eye. Jake marched forward slowly with the sword pointed at David's chest. David was forced to back away until his back was pinned to the wall behind him. The atmosphere of suspense that surrounded them was palpable. The sword began to hum once again. The hum of the sword punctuated Jake's murderous intent. He could kill David, and nothing would happen. David would just become a part of the carnage and body count that littered the alley. He could pay David back with interest for all of the suffering that David had caused him. But doing that wouldn't make him feel better. It surprised him how calmly he was thinking when all he wanted to do was destroy everything in his sight. Grief was reigning supreme in him at the moment. He looked back at the coat draped over his father's corpse. The look in his father's eyes as the sword was pulled out of his warm body replayed in his mind, and he whimpered. He thought of Adeola. He thought about how violence broke her heart. Gradually, he lowered the sword and released the trigger. The ominous humming stopped.
Sorry,
Jake dropped the charge blade to the ground.
No, I'm sorry. Things got out of hand.
David observed the carnage they stood amongst.
We should get out of here.
Jake nodded and allowed David to lead the way out. There was a prolonged silence between them as they walked away from the alley.
Why wouldn't you guys just leave me alone?
I don't know.
David stopped and seriously considered the question. Sure, he was annoyed at how weird Jake was towards him at the beginning of the semester, but he barely remembered that encounter. Why didn't he let it go? He was mad at Jake for some unknown reason. But why? When the class ranks were updated each week, Jake's name was always first, while his name was always near the bottom.
I think I was jealous of you. I'm struggling not to flunk out of that fancy school. Ma could barely pay for it.
Huh.
I know, it sounds stupid.
Because it just asked me for help.
You would have done that for me?
Yeah. It's better to get beat up every day. Besides, not like I was busy with a bunch of friends. Being alone all the time, after a while, it messes with your head. Being around other people, it helps.
Yeah, I was thinking you had it easy.
If you only knew.
David decided to get Jake talking, to help take Jake's mind off of recent events.
Why'd you skip out today?
He asked. Jake thought about this for a while. It was true that he would not have met Adeola if he had gone to school, but they would have jumped him if he had gone past the gate.
You and your guys were planning to jump me, so I ran.
Where'd you get that idea?
I spotted Earl hiding behind the steps.
His countenance went dark.
Unlike you, I made the class on time today.
David laughed.
Earl's a weirdo. He's probably taking a leak outside again.
Jake felt embarrassed about his incorrect assumption. He played around with the sword and frowned.
We should get you to a doctor.
A realization washed over Jake and he stopped in his tracks. He thought of Adeola. He thought about how lost and alone she felt.
I need to go after her.
What now?
David was confused. Jake stared at David.
Adeola, I need to go after her.
Who's what?
The Arez girl you saw me with. That's her name. I need to bring her back. I know it doesn't make sense. She's safe away from here.
But
she wouldn't be happy back on her planet. She'd be alone.
This is really stupid, and it may get us killed.
Us?
Yeah, us.
He couldn't muster a response. He was too overwhelmed.
Well, do we at least have a plan?
I'm working on it.
His eyes watered up slightly.
All right then, let's go.
Right there, the wall between the two boys felt like Jericho, and they accepted each other like longtime friends. Chapter 14. Regret. An Arez warship waited in the orbit of Jophiel. The massive ship housed a crew of over 1,000. It took that many hands to man such a gargantuan vessel. At the peak of the ship resided the captain's quarters. Within, a tall Arez woman sat in a corner sipping an exotic tea. She wore a spacesuit similar to Adeola's gear. A crimson cape was draped over her left shoulder before flowing down her back onto the chair. The cape was adorned with a large emblem which denoted her military rank, General. She had long black hair that was cut bald on the left side of her head to proudly display tattoos, which signified her house and tribe. This woman was Nyasi of the Umfalm tribe, the rulers of Samael. Nyasi was worried sick. She had been worried for close to a month. Her beloved baby sister Adeola was missing, lost somewhere out there in the indifferent cosmos. She had to battle with the elders for permission to venture deeper into neutral space. If her father and the elders realized she had ventured as far as Jophiel, they would be outraged. Luckily, her crew was loyal to her, and they would keep her secret. But now a new complication had arisen. How did her sister end up on a Terran space colony? Nyasi's anxiety intensified at the thought of Adeola in the clutches of the Terrans. Her father would caution her about them. They are a godless people without honor, he would say. They have no souls. Now, these soulless creatures had her little sister. Sending an infiltration team into a Terran colony was a risky venture, but saving Adeola was worth whatever punishment awaited Nyasi back home on Samael. A panel on the wall next to the door lit up and began to beep. Finally, they have returned, she thought. Nyasi walked to the door and pressed a button on the control panel. A large male officer stood outside the door with his head bowed.
General Nyasi, the infiltration team has returned with the princess. They are in the infirmary.
Nyasi pushed the man aside as she hurriedly walked towards the lift down the long corridor. The officer collected himself and followed. She arrived at the lift well before him, then pressed the button to descend, shutting the door before he could enter. Her imagination was getting the better of her. She surmised her sister was injured, but to what extent? She jabbed at the button, knowing the lift wouldn't move any faster, but it was all she could do at that moment. The lift finally arrived at its destination, and the doors slid open on the infirmary level of the ship. A medic was waiting for her at the door. He bowed upon seeing her. Before he could utter a word, Nyasi cut him off.
Where? This way, General.
He meekly replied. They walked past an operation in progress. Nyasi could see it was a member of the infiltration team that she sent into Lhasa, their leader. The woman was convulsing as medics tended to a severe wound on her neck. The other two warriors stood before a door which led into the next room. As Nyasi approached the pair, they both dropped to one knee and held their right fists to their left shoulders. Nyasi, regardless of her royal blood, didn't encourage such grand displays of fealty from her subordinates. She felt it was bad for morale. Deeds were all the proof she needed of loyalty. Her crew only felt the need to kneel before her when they felt they had failed her. Everyone had been bowing or kneeling before Nyasi since she left her cabin. She stopped before opening the door to the next room. She was fearful of what she might find on the other side. Could she endure seeing her baby sister's corpse beyond this door? Was that what was waiting for her? Was that the reason for all of this bowing? She had rushed from her quarters to reach this door, but now she couldn't open it. She did her best to compose herself before gesturing to the two warriors kneeling before her to open the door. They obeyed her command before returning to their knees. Within the operation room, Adeola was prostrate upon the operating table, battered, bloodied, bruised, and clinging to life as medics tended to her injuries. The Terrans were just as horrible as Nyasi was told. Who could do such things to a child? Nyasi walked to the head of the table. She placed her fingers on Adeola's temples and then bowed to press her forehead to Adeola's forehead. She recited a silent prayer and then stood in silence for a few moments. She was on the verge of breaking down, but held it together, refusing to show such weakness in front of her subordinates. She tapped a communicator on her chest beneath her cape.
Bridge. Bring us around Yafiel.
Governor Manning sat in his office, sipping an aged Merlot from a short, square-shaped glass. He was aware that Catherine Fisher had botched things with the alien intruder, and he was running scenarios in his mind on how to salvage the situation in his favor. This would be a tough election year, given what had transpired today, but not one he couldn't win. He just needed to paint a picture the people could rally behind. They didn't want the truth from their leaders. They just told themselves that. What they desired was something to believe in. A story that made them feel good and important. He was sipping his drink as he constructed this fable. Thus far, he'd been hitting a wall. Manning became distracted by an image of his daughter on his desk. He hadn't gazed upon the blue-eyed girl since the divorce had been finalized. He tilted his head a little and allowed himself a smile. As he gazed at his daughter's face, he thought of Catherine. Was that why he took such a liking to that awkward woman? Because she reminded him of his Elizabeth? Was this why all of his plans on how to deal with this situation also included protecting her? Manning's success in life came from his ability to assess his thoughts and motivations honestly. He didn't run from this new realization. He weighed the prospect of protecting Catherine against what made sense for his career and future. He had given Catherine a chance to prove herself, and she failed. True strength was the ability to capitalize on opportunity. Sadly, Catherine had earned her fate. For the first time in a long time, Manning dreaded what needed to be done. Manning's datapad began to beep. Lewis Johnston had proven himself to be too incompetent to be kept in the loop. Manning was getting all data concerning station security routed directly to his datapad. His eyes went wide and he stood up as he scanned what was on the pad.
An Arez battleship. Here?
He hurriedly checked fleet deployments. This was disastrous. 80 years of no contact with the enemy had led to lackadaisical patrols. The nearest Terran fleet was hours away. If Manning had reached out to Colonial Command when the intruder was first reported on the colony, a fleet would already be en route. This was on him. Aboard the Arez juggernaut, Nyasi marched onto the ship's bridge with the 2 remaining warriors of the infiltration team accompanying her. The bridge crew took notice of the general's arrival. Confusion was in the air. Her first officer approached.
General Nyasi, why did you order us into an intercept course with the colony?
Stand aside.
Nyasi spoke while looking at Lhasa colony on the large view screen. Commander Ugin had proudly served under General Nyasi for years. He trusted her with his life, but he could tell something was amiss.
General, I understand what you are going through, but this is not the way.
Nyasi looked to the warrior on her right. The woman hesitated for a brief moment before pulling out her sidearm and backing Ugin to the wall. The crew looked on in shock as Nyasi walked to the center of the bridge.
Charge all weapons and take aim.
Her voice was cold and distant.
On my mark.
Belay that order!
Are you mounting an insurrection, Commander?
General, Princess, do not do this.
Status.
A bridge officer reluctantly answered her query.
Weapons at the ready, ma'am.
Nyasi took a deep breath. The silence gripped the hearts of everyone on the bridge. The short moment of silence seemed to last for an eternity. They all waited on edge for Nyasi's next order. All of them secretly hoped she would order them to stand down.
All weapons, open fire.
Meanwhile, on Lhasa colony, Jake and David were scouring the streets for any signs of Adeola and the 2 warriors. They hadn't worked out what the plan would be when they found them, but still, they persisted. They were using Travis Takeda's makeshift scanning device to track the energy signature of Adeola's spacesuit, but the signal went dead about half an hour ago. Jake feared the warriors had already left the station with Adeola. Jake brought the alien sword along with them and had it wrapped in his school blazer so it wouldn't be noticed at a glance. He stopped and winced in pain.
We should get you to a hospital to get that shoulder looked at.
I'm fine. I'm good. We gotta find Ed.
Yeah. Were you able to get that signal again?
No.
Jake was starting to accept that Adeola was gone. At that moment, the ground violently quaked, tossing the 2 boys into the air and back down.
What the void was that?
The ground continued to quake. Jake looked up and he could see purple flashes of light behind the clouds. Other onlookers stopped to gaze up at the sky also. There was a shadowy object in the sky.
Huh? What is that?
David asked as he squinted his eyes to make it out. Jake noticed the object was getting larger.
Run.
Huh?
Run!
The 2 boys took off running down the street. David glanced back as they ran.
Is that where I think it is?
The object was close enough to identify. It was a section of a building that had broken free. The onlookers finally realized what was happening. They scattered in all directions, but it was too late for them.
Donies are supposed to fall down, not up. What the void is happening?
David yelled as they ran. The large piece of debris crashed down onto the street, sending out a cloud of dust. More building pieces rained down from the sky all over the area. The boys pumped their legs in a desperate attempt to outrun the dust cloud. Jake was beginning to lag behind. David grabbed him by the arm to help him keep up, and they kept up the pace until the cloud of dust enveloped them. On the other side of the station, where the building piece originated from, geysers of purple light were erupting from the ground and tearing away pieces of the colony in their wake. The debris was being projected by force to the opposite cityscape. Buildings were being decimated at their foundations. They would break apart, then what wasn't blasted away would implode back down into the hole in the exterior of the colony. People and objects near these blast points were sucked out into space. Aboard her mighty battleship, Nyasi watched as the purple lasers blasted from her vessel's cannons impacted upon the surface of Lhasa colony. She looked on as holes formed in the colony's exterior and its energy shields struggled to stay active due to the barrage. This carnage did not have the desired effect Nyasi was seeking. She thought making the Terrans suffer would be justice for her sister, but this didn't feel like justice. She had lowered herself in a moment of vulnerability and anger. These weren't the honorable actions of an umfalm, a general. This was an abuse of power.
Cease fire!
Nyasi abruptly yelled out. She then gestured for the warrior holding Ugin at gunpoint to stand down.
Commander Ugin, the ship is now under your command.
Ugin adjusted his uniform as he approached her.
I will go and sit with my sister in the infirmary. When we return to Samael, I will answer for my actions here.
Yes, ma'am.
Ugin replied.
Helm, get us back to neutral space immediately.
Yes, Commander.
A helmswoman replied. Nyasi walked off the ship's bridge, followed by the two warriors. They entered the lift. One of the women pressed the button for the infirmary deck before taking her place next to the other warrior standing behind Nyasi. They all stood there in silence as the lift descended. Nyasi pressed the stop button on the lift's panel, bringing it to a halt. She turned around to face the two masked women. Once again, the two warriors dropped to their knees in deference.
Stand,
Nyasi demanded. The two women in unison rose to their feet and stood at attention.
Remove your helmets.
They reluctantly complied with Nyasi's order. She examined their faces. The woman on the left was seasoned. Her scarred face betrayed no emotion. The girl on the right was the younger of the two, and she was visibly upset. She had short burgundy hair, and her skin tone was a lighter shade of red. The tattoo on the right side of her neck was that of the Burta tribe. They were mountain folk, mostly farmers. Her bright green eyes were wet with tears that she was refusing to let flow.
I am sorry, General. We failed you,
the girl said as her voice quivered.
I tasked you with bringing my sister back, and you did.
Yes, but...
You succeeded in your mission.
Nyasi reached beneath her cape and handed the girl a piece of cloth.
Dry your eyes, warrior.
Thank you, General.
The girl eventually accepted Nyasi's gift and wiped her eyes.
What is your name, girl?
Takeda, ma'am.
On the bridge. Why did you hesitate, Takeda?
I do not know, General.
Takeda replied after a long pause.
Why?
The order. It did not feel like the right thing to do.
But still, you obeyed.
Yes, ma'am.
Nyasi placed her hand on Dakeda's shoulder.
There are sparse times when the orders you are given are wrong. And it is up to you to cherish them.
How will I know the difference?
She removed her hand and then turned to face the lift door.
You will know. When the time comes again, you will know.
She pressed the button on the panel and the lift began to move again. Takeda thought back to the mission on Lhasa colony. The look in that boy's eyes had gotten to her. She did what was necessary to save Princess Adeola's life. But still, taking a child's father from him as he watched, even the most seasoned warrior would feel the weight of such a deed in the core of their soul. She thought of her mother, the leader of the infiltration team, who was clinging to life in the infirmary. She prayed for her mother's fast recovery. She's strong, a wound like that is no match for her, Takeda thought to herself. The lift doors opened into the infirmary. Takeda was still full of questions, but the time to ask them had passed. She and the other warrior followed behind Nyasi as a half-excited medic rushed across the infirmary floor to meet them.
General, your sister is in stable condition. I will take you to her.
Nyasi followed the short man to her sister's bedside. She nonchalantly held up her hand to order her warriors to wait outside of the room. Takeda watched as the door closed behind her. She wondered why the great princess and General Nyasi Umfalm took an interest in her for those fleeting moments. She was just a girl from a small mountain village, far removed from importance. At that moment, in her heart, Takeda vowed to be worthy of General Nyasi's advice. She would dedicate her all to protecting her world and its people. Takeda scanned the infirmary for her mother. She then looked to the other warrior standing by the door, almost as if she was asking permission. The woman nodded, and Takeda went off searching. There was no sign of her mother in the operations area, save for a medical table stained with her mother's blood. She continued her search to no avail. There was only one area left to inspect. Takeda had refused to look there, but she knew it was cowardly not to do so. She entered the morgue. On the far wall, a ceremonial candle was lit. These candles were lit to honor fallen heroes. Beneath it, wrapped in a decorative blanket, was a body. The intricate patterns on the blanket were that of the Buerta mountain tribe. Takeda clenched her fist and bit her lip, drawing a drop of blood. She held back her tears. Her mother would have considered such a display a dishonor. Warriors are not allowed such weakness. Rejoice for the warriors who fall in battle, her mother would say, for Mars truly smiles upon them. As hard as she tried, Takeda couldn't bring herself to smile. She just wished her mother wasn't gone.
Citizens of Lhasa, this is not a drill. This is a priority alert. Please report immediately to your nearest evacuation facility. Emergency teams will assist you with safely leaving the colony.
Chapter 15. Picking up the pieces. David snapped awake. He coughed violently, expelling dust and debris from his mouth and throat. Was this savage battlefield Lhasa? It was surreal. He felt pressure on his chest and attempted to stand up. A large broken column was pinning him down. Luckily, part of the column had landed on top of a Vespa. Otherwise, he would have been crushed by it. He tried to wiggle out from beneath it. He managed to slip out as far as his crotch before a part of the bike broke off due to the weight of the column. This slightly lowered it, trapping him again. David would only have one chance at his next escape attempt. He pushed the column with all of his strength. When he felt he could move, he swung his legs out from beneath it and rolled to his side. The Vespa broke in half, and the column smashed onto the ground an inch behind his back. David rested his spine against the column and gasped for air. He let out another hard cough because he had just inhaled a significant amount of dust. He was tempted to lie there until a rescue team noticed him, but then he remembered.
Buttons.
If David had that much of a problem freeing himself from the wreckage, there was no telling what kind of trouble a wimpy kid like Jake was in.
He can't be that far. He was right behind me.
He had to find him. David stood up, then tossed his legs over the column and slid to the other side. The bike exploded, and a storefront collapsed behind him into the spot where he was previously trapped. He jumped out of his skin and glanced back.
That was close.
He would have to be cautious as he searched for Jake. Any one of these buildings could collapse at any second. He heard an all-too-familiar humming sound. He walked around a pile of rubble, and there he found it, the alien sword. There was a piece of rubble stuck in the trigger guard, so the sword was activated and cutting into the ground. David jogged past the sword and then spotted Jake a few feet away. Jake was unconscious on the ground. David crouched and started slapping him on the face with just enough force to wake him. After a few moments, Jake came to.
Adeola?
Nah, you're not that lucky. Come on, we gotta get out of here.
Assad?
Okay, that big brain of yours is still intact. It might come in handy.
Help me up?
That was the plan, genius.
David stood and grabbed Jake by his right forearm. He pulled, and Jake let out a pained scream.
Wait. My left hand is trapped. Feels like it's going to rip off.
Jake pleaded. David inspected the immediate area. Jake's hand was pinned beneath a large piece of debris. An immense hologram dominated the sky. It was of a member of the station security personnel with an urgent announcement.
Citizens of Lhasa, this is not a drill. This is a priority alert. Please report immediately to your nearest evacuation facility. Emergency teams will assist you with safely leaving the colony.
The clouds are gone.
Jake noticed out loud.
So?
Take a look.
David looked up. Without the clouds, the other side of the station was clearly visible. Most of it was burning, and there were large holes in the cityscape.
What, the void?
That flickering in his shield? That's backup power. They're not gonna hold for long.
So let's hurry up and get you out of here. I'm bet you're glad you didn't cut me in half earlier.
David was trying to lift the block on top of Jake's hand.
Wait. I can't feel my hand, but my wrist feels wet. If you move that block, I think I might bleed out.
So what do we do?
David asked.
You have to save yourself.
That's not an option, Buttons. Think of something better.
Listen, If we both stay, we both die.
That's the best you can come up with? I thought you were smart. How are you gonna see your alien girlfriend again if you die here?
Okay. Let's figure this out.
Jake got that look on his face, the look he got when solving a puzzle.
All right, I guess I'm speaking your language now.
Jake began running the numbers. At first, he included David in the process, but eventually, he wasn't even listening to David's feedback. He was just thinking out loud. David caught on and let him work it out on his own.
All right. Tourniquet, lever, sword, shoes.
Shoes? Why are you staring at my shoes?
David was puzzled.
You walked through that alley, but there's no blood on your shoes.
Yeah, there's none on yours either.
That Arez warrior, she was cutting through officers left or right. Should've been blood everywhere, but there's not.
You're saying her blade cauterizes as it cuts?
Exactly. Dave, where's the sword? Where is it at?
It's right over...
David's jaw dropped. While the charged blade was stuck in the sidewalk, the vibrations from its edge had created a small sinkhole. The weapon was on the verge of falling into a pit and out of reach. David dashed to retrieve it. The ground cracked and the sword began its descent. He jumped onto his stomach and followed the weapon down into the hole with his right arm. If the sword flipped while falling, it would slice his hand off. He was prone over the hole for a moment.
Dave, did you get it?
David gradually stood up as he pulled his arm from the hole. The weapon followed his arm out, hilt in his grip. Both boys let out sighs of relief.
All right. What now?
Now?
Before he even uttered them, Jake couldn't believe the words that would come out of his mouth. He also was unsure if he'd be able to go through with it.
Now you have to cut my hand off with it.
What?
My left hand, it's completely crushed.
He stopped as he winced in pain.
The only way I'm getting out of here is without it.
Holy shit.
David jogged over with the sword.
You sure about this?
Boy, no, but we're out of options. Dave, I want to live, Dave.
David took a deep breath as he lined up the cut and raised the sword high above his head.
All right, okay. Here goes.
Pull the trigger to activate it first, moron.
David stopped mid-slash. He narrowed his eyes at Jake.
You just made this a lot easier.
He pulled the trigger on the hilt and readied his next attempt. Jake wistfully gazed at the broken cityscape in the sky.
This reminds me of a matinee I saw. It was a war film. They were operating on this soldier in the battlefield, and so the medic gave him a swig of... Ah!
David cut the left hand off above the wrist while Jake was pontificating. Jake rolled onto his side, clutching his stump.
Why didn't you warn me first?
This was the manliest moment of your life, and you almost missed it. Listen, Buttons, if we're gonna be hanging out, you gotta stop talking so damn much.
Point taken.
All right, let's get you out of here.
David dropped the sword. He wrapped his arm around Jake's back and helped him up.
You know, it's common courtesy. They give a guy a heads up before you cut his arm off.
Jake let out a painful laugh at the joke.
Looks like you got your sense of humor back.
Wait, grab a sword.
Why?
I don't think they'll be checking people for alien weapons at the escape pods.
Why do you even want to keep it?
Because it's mine.
Man, you're so weird.
David said as he grabbed the sword from the ground with his free hand.
And I've had manly moments before. They all happened today, but still, they count.
Yeah, about that. Did you and that alien girl?
Adeola. Her name's Adeola.
Anything happen there?
A gentleman doesn't talk about this stuff. And that's Princess Adeola to you.
I hate you. Really? An alien princess? You?
The two argued as they hastily made their way to the escape pods. Chapter 16. Apathy. Catherine Fisher was in a daze as she picked herself up from the floor of her tiny office. She must have blacked out during the Arez attack on the colony. Her office was a shadow of its former self. Rubble adorned the shelves and desk. She unlocked the door and made her way out. There was once a long window in the hallway, but all that was left of it was scattered shards. She peered outside. The cityscape was in ruins as emergency crews rushed about, tending to the injured. Catherine's eyes filled with tears as she looked toward the governor's office building across the broken municipal plaza. She covered her mouth in horror. There was nothing left but a large gaping hole and floating debris. Through the hole, she could see the flickering emergency energy shields, the only force keeping the citizenry from all being sucked out into the cold indifference of space. It was clear to her that Governor Manning was dead, along with her opportunities to move up the ladder of society.
Help! Please, help!
A distant voice screamed out for help, echoing throughout the desolate hallway. Catherine limped toward the source of the voice, which was coming out of the open door of Louis Johnston's large office. The office was soundproofed. If the door hadn't been ajar, the desperate plea would have gone unheard. She slinked through the door, and there Louis was, pinned beneath his gargantuan desk. It must have flipped over on top of him during the attack. His fancy suit was in tatters, his glorious hair was a mess, and he only had one arm free. The rest of his body was beneath the desk.
Kathy? Kathy, thank goodness. Hurry. Get help.
He managed to say through huffs. His face came alive with hope when he saw her. Catherine just stood there at the center of his office.
Kathy? Are you okay?
She gazed at him, and then out the window to the large hole that was once Arthur Manning's office building. She couldn't stop the tear that escaped from her left eye. She looked to the corner behind her. The coffee machine lay on its side on the counter. She walked to it, righted it, then got to work preparing a cup.
Kathy, what are you doing?
He coughed blood and his face was flushed.
There's no time. We need to get out of here.
She ignored him and focused on making the coffee. The aroma filled the room as she poured it into his favorite mug. Slowly, Catherine picked up the mug and gently blew over it to cool it. She picked a napkin up from the floor and placed it under the mug on top of her hand as she escorted the drink across the room. She sat on the floor next to him and gently placed the mug on the floor within reach of his free arm.
Drink.
Her expression was poker-faced. Louis looked at her with confusion dancing in his eyes. He wanted to ask if she was all right, but all he could say was,
What?
Please, drink it.
Listen, Kathy, we've both been through a lot. You must be in shock, but we...
Drink it, and I'll go get help.
He was visibly shaken by the odd request.
Go get help now!
His brave attempt at yelling brought on an onset of coughs. Catherine ignored his distress. Rather than help, she let out a sigh, picked up the mug, and presented it to him. With an unsteady hand, Louis accepted the cup and took a sip.
Yeah, delicious. Now let's...
Finish it. It's your preferred blend.
He was petrified by the distant, yet serene look in Catherine's eyes. It almost felt like she was staring through him, like she wasn't seeing him. He nodded, and she placed the cup to his lips. Carefully, she tilted the mug as Louis drank, some coffee spilling to the sides of his mouth. He was gulping down the hot drink as fast as he could. Catherine suddenly pulled back the mug from his lips.
Why?
What?
The governor's office? The coffee? Why?
I don't know what you're talking about, Kathy.
I'm not going to get help until we sort this out.
All right. You've been eyeing my chair since you got here.
He started to say with a bite of his lower lip.
Was I supposed to just hand it over to you?
The strain in his voice was apparent. The pain was getting to him.
None of this was pursed, though, Kathy.
His eyes rolled back into his skull for a moment. He couldn't stave off the pain any longer.
It's just politics. It's just a game.
Louis collapsed on the floor. His words vanished into the dusty air. The pain from his injuries finally made him black out. Catherine sat there and watched him for a few moments. She reached into his jacket, removed his black comb, and meticulously groomed his hair. Without force, she placed the comb back into his breast pocket and then stood to her feet. Outside, the sirens were blaring and mingling with cries of help. She wondered how many people would survive this, how many would remember her part in this. Her breathing was deep and full as she walked to the door. She looked back at Louis, passed out beneath his heavy desk. He looked so peaceful. She imagined this was how death was, like sleep. She had always imagined death was a gruesome event that left you kicking and screaming, but seeing Louis in this position somehow passed on courage to her. An awkward smile passed her face briefly as she walked out of the office that had chained her career. She closed the door and felt the looseness of the broken doorknob in her hand. Her hand trembled despite her effort to steady it. Calmly, she pulled off her right shoe. Suddenly, she let out a manic scream that was full of anguish. Without breaking form, she repeatedly smashed the shoe into the doorknob while screaming. Her scream didn't stop until the knob broke free and rolled across the floor. She fell against the door and then slowly slid down to the floor. There was a crashing sound down the hall. Someone had kicked the stairway door open.
Is anyone up here?
A large man asked as he jogged up the hallway.
Miss Fisher, are you okay? Can you stand?
He stopped in front of Catherine and appraised the situation. His station security uniform was torn and burnt in different parts. When she didn't respond, the man carefully picked her up in his arms and carried her down the hall towards the stairs.
Is there anyone else on this floor? Have you seen anyone?
No. It was just me.
Chapter 17. Longing. Adeola slowly opened her eyes. Her vision was blurry, and everything was a shade of red or purple. There was a voice. Her perception was too foggy to decipher whose it was.
Jake?
Her sight began to clear, and her other senses slowly returned. Adeola could now vaguely make out her sister's normally stoic face.
Nyasi?
Nyasi's expression betrayed a myriad of emotions: concern, joy, fear, relief, regret. They all sprung from her visage like a dam bursting. Adeola felt guilty for what she put Nyasi through. She was selfish, childish, and her sister had to suffer for her mistakes. She couldn't move, but she felt Nyasi squeezing her hand tightly and speaking words she was too disoriented to make out. She was dismayed and cursed herself. She should have felt joy in this moment, being reunited with her sister, being in a place where she was safe, protected. But she wasn't happy. Sadness gripped her soul. She was returning to a world where she didn't fit in, a place she ran away from, a world where no one noticed how much pain she was in. To make matters worse, the only person who truly understood her, who shared that subtle agony, would be a galaxy away. Adeola mustered all the strength she had and squeezed her sister's hand. She wanted to let Nyasi know that she would be okay. She knew she would eventually bump heads with her sister and the rest of her family, but she could no longer be who everyone around her wanted her to be. She needed to walk her own path, speak with her own voice, and fight for her own ideals. Perhaps her little excursion to Lhasa was no accident. Perhaps she was meant to go there. She always felt that something was amiss on her homeworld, that her people were too stuck in their ways, and it was holding them back. There was a cruelty that infected their culture. If left unchecked, it could lead them to their end. Instead of running from what they were, she could guide them to something better. Now that she had a better understanding of herself, she was eager to help others. Adeola had a mission now, a reason to fight. Jake was on an escape pod hurtling away from the remains of Lhasa. It was less a pod and more like a small transport vessel, which was capable of housing up to 50 people. It was referred to as a pod because it lacked a cockpit. If the need was great enough, even a child could launch a pod from the colony to safety. A simple design, no pilot, no landing gear, just a rocket that could get civilians a safe distance from the colony with a communication array and enough supplies to last until help arrived. Survivors surrounded Jake, but he was still alone. His thoughts were of Adeola. When they met, she had threatened to kill him. But now, all he could think about was her smile. The thought of it made him smile momentarily. He wondered if she was okay, if she was safe. But most of all, he wondered if he'd ever see her again. It was like a piece of him was missing. He gazed down at his missing limb. Yesterday, a loss like this would have destroyed him, but he was stronger now. He could bear this pain because he wasn't just living for himself anymore. There was a universe that existed outside of his mind that he was eager to explore. He tapped his right index finger 3 times at where his left wrist would have been. He could still feel his left hand, his fingers wiggling. Out of habit, he had attempted to update. He shook his head. Due to space limitations, David ended up leaving on a different pod. They agreed to seek each other out once they got their feet back on solid ground. For the first time since he freed Adeola from the egg, Jake was alone again. He used to relish his time alone, time to solve a puzzle or to engage in a hobby. But after letting others in, opening up, he realized he spent most of that time alone because he found it too difficult to connect with other people. He tried to hide his awkwardness by keeping his distance, but now he knew that it was okay to be awkward. Everyone was working through something. Jake's thoughts drifted to the sword. Sadly, he had to ditch the charge blade in a storage locker outside of the evacuation facility. David convinced him that it would be impossible to bring it along. He accepted that it was the right move, but still, it ate at him to leave it behind. He decided he would go back for it one day. Why was he so fascinated by the weapon? Why did he need it so badly? He felt like he had earned the blade. It was his Excalibur. He took action and won the sword from its former wielder. That weapon saved his life in the end. Being brave in that moment led to his survival. He was more capable than he knew, but he had to keep pushing himself. If he wasn't brave enough, he may never see Adeola again. Catherine sat near the front of the pod. She would occasionally steal a glance at Jake. She gazed at his missing hand, and a part of her was overcome with guilt. She was tempted to go over to him and confess. I've scarred that poor boy for life, she thought. The impulse to unburden herself came and went. She wasn't built for the kind of punishment that awaited someone who had trespassed as she had. Her survival instinct kept her guilt in check. I can make it right some other way, she thought.
Riding away on a prison moon isn't going to replace what he's lost. I promise I'll make this right somehow, kid. Okay? Once I make it, I won't forget your sacrifice.
Her thoughts drifted to Louis Johnston.
There was no way to save him,
she quietly convinced herself.
You didn't kill him. People would have died trying to remove that fool from beneath that ridiculous desk.
She leaned forward in her seat and placed her face into her palms.
I couldn't help him. He was too far gone. There was nothing I could do. I could not help.
These internal conversations were exhausting.
I did the right thing. I locked that door to save others from a pointless rescue attempt.
As hard as she tried, she couldn't convince herself of the righteousness of her actions. Catherine felt uncomfortable being packed into such a small space with so many people. People always made her feel uneasy. She treasured her time away from others. She had been trying to recede away into her bubble as she often did behind her locked office door. Every now and then, a rescue worker would provide her with an unasked-for update about the current situation. These updates were frequent. Were they reporting to her? She pulled out her datapad and went through the known survivors list. After a few moments of research, the answer became all too clear. The municipal plaza was on a section of the colony that took direct fire from the Arez assault. Everyone above Catherine had died in the attack. She was in charge right now. Anxiety came over her. She had been technically leading the station security department behind the scenes for over a year, but to officially be the leader was new for her. This was the recognition that she was searching for, but now that she had it, it was terrifying. Her knee began to tremble. She quickly clutched it with her hand before anyone else noticed. She was slowly gaining the attention of the other passengers. The keen-eyed among the citizenry had noticed the colony personnel reporting to her, and word was spreading. Catherine knew what needed to be done, but she didn't know if she was capable of pulling it off. She had to speak to these people and wear the mask of the leader they wanted. She'd always been an introvert, always an invisible face in the crowd. In this moment, her future hinged upon her ability to be anyone else. She thought of trying to imitate Governor Manning, but that wouldn't work. Manning's speech delivery was too confident and seasoned. It took time to develop that level of competency. It wasn't something that could be aped. She then considered Louis Johnston's style of oration, a golden smile spewing feel-good catchphrases. He could captivate an audience, but it was with charisma alone. He wasn't a man of substance or talent, just a man gifted with a magnetism that drew people to him. He had an aura that lured people into trusting him. Another dead end, she thought. Catherine had spent her short lifetime repelling others, because behind all of her defenses was an exposed nerve. She was far more sensitive than she let on. A constant fear of being hurt by others had molded her into an island. This speech had to be in her voice, but that would leave her vulnerable, laid bare in front of everyone. The only way this was going to work would be for her to lower defenses and dive in headfirst.
I need an open line to all of the escape pods.
She asked a member of personnel.
Yes, ma'am.
Catherine waited as the worker made preparations.
Okay, it's all ready for you.
She took a deep breath, then turned to face the citizens in the pod.
People of...
Her voice cracked. She accepted that small defeat and pushed forward.
I'm the acting director of station security, Catherine Fisher.
She struggled to get the words out as she corrected her posture. The crowd looked unimpressed.
People of Lhasa, my fellow Terrans. Today, our liberty, our very way of life, came under attack. Thousands of our fellow citizens' lives were cut short by uncompromising evil. The Arez hate us because our existence, our culture, is the shining example of everything they can never achieve. This was a cowardly attempt to destroy us, but they failed. The only thing our enemy accomplished today was to strengthen our resolve. We will not be intimidated. We will not be made afraid. They could take our home, they could take our lives, but they can never defeat us. Mark my words, my fellow Lhasans. There will be justice for the Terran blood that was shed today. Together, we will exact that justice. Together, we will march forward into a future free of fear and tyranny.
There was silence. She had opened herself up for the ultimate rejection, and this was it. The words were there, but the delivery of the speech was just as awkward as Catherine was. Her heart sank as she braced herself for jeers and ridicule. An old woman in her late 70s slowly stood up from her seat. She stared at Catherine for a moment, then began to clap her hands. A man in the back corner of the pod stood up and followed suit, then another denizen and another. Soon everyone aboard the pod was on their feet and applauding in support of Catherine's speech. The same was happening on the other pods. The words and sentiment were enough. The people just wanted to be reassured in their hour of need. They wanted a story that put them at the center and made them feel good about themselves. A story that allowed them to lament what was lost while focusing them against a common evil. Everything worked out better than Catherine could have possibly imagined. A wave of relief washed over her. She stole another glance at Jake. He was silently sitting alone, cradling his left arm. He was the only person still seated. He looked up at her, and she quickly averted her eyes. The guilt of her earlier deeds came rushing back into her mind. The citizens aboard the pod began to crowd around her. The crowd eventually blocked Jake from Catherine's view. She could finally enjoy her small victory, free from the weight of his presence. The pod shook as if it hit turbulence. The disturbance originated from the Lhasa colony. The emergency energy shields surrounding Lhasa had finally failed. The atmosphere within the colony was violently expelled into space, taking small structures and objects with it. Vehicles, bodies, household items, and other debris spewed from the gaping holes in the colony's exterior. This chaos within the colony lasted for minutes, until there was complete silence, a stillness, the total absence of life, and the environmental requirements to sustain it. Lhasa's interior had become one with the vast emptiness of space. This place that was once home to so many was now a lifeless husk, drifting through the cosmos. Lhasa colony was now a part of the past. Epilogue. Jake waited with a large group of fellow refugees at Trinity Outpost. Trinity Outpost was located on the moon of Ansel, which orbited planet Celophiel. Jake and the other refugees were picked up by rescue vessels close to a week ago. The journey to Trinity was trying, and it was a relief to be on solid ground again. Lhasa and Jophiel were dangerously close to neutral space, but no Arez fleet would dare trespass as far as Ansel. The previous war didn't even spread this far into Terran space. Jake was clenching and relaxing his new prosthetic left hand. He underwent the painful surgery to have it installed just hours before. It felt tight, like it wasn't a part of him yet. The nurses told him that it would take time to adjust to the new appendage. It looked similar to a frame's hand, with the occasional exposed sections of gears and shifting mechanisms. These exposed areas were necessary for the hand to have as full of a range of motion as his original. He had a phantom sensation. It felt like he had two left hands on one arm, slightly out of sync with one another. Jake was wearing a new Navi device on his left wrist, which was given to him by the outpost personnel. He came close to updating several times, but stopped. He'd been triple tapping his left wrist all week, but now that he had a Navi, he was hesitant. Maybe he was waiting until after he saw them. Even though he was still missing a new pair of specs, he touched the bridge of his nose out of habit, as he often did when feeling anxious or perplexed. A woman in a military uniform approached the group.
Takeda? Jacob Takeda?
Jake stood and stepped forward.
Please, follow me.
She escorted Jake down a long hallway. They arrived at a door, and she held out her wrist beneath a scanner on an adjacent panel. The door slid open, and she gestured for Jake to enter alone. Once he was inside, she tapped the panel to close the door behind him. A chair was at the center of the small, dark room with a datapad mounted onto the left arm of it. As Jake sat down, he observed the welcome graphic of the Shangri-La Ghost server displayed on the pad. There were 5 circles overlaid on top of the graphic, a fingerprint scanner. Jake took a deep breath before pressing his left hand to the pad. There was no response. He made another attempt and then sighed as he gazed at his new robotic hand.
Obviously, the geniuses responsible for this interface didn't factor in amputees.
He spent the next few moments contorting his right hand to work the sinister fingerprint scanner. He was on the verge of frustration before he noticed an unlabeled icon in the corner of the screen. With a tap of the icon, the screen flipped to a right-handed scan.
Oh, my apology to the geniuses.
With that inconvenience behind him, Jake exhaled, then touched his fingerprints to the datapad. He wasn't sure of how this was going to play out, but he was eager to see them again. 2 round projectors in the floor began to spin and sprung to life with rainbow-like patterns of light. 2 holographic humanoid forms began to take shape. Jake adjusted his clothing and made sure to sit up straight. The projector on the left conked out and went dark. The woman's voice spoke to him over an intercom.
Sorry about that. These things have been running all day. Just give it a minute, okay?
A holographic image of Travis Takeda had already taken shape above the right projector.
Son?
Pop?
Son. Delete the holovids on my private datapad. Don't look at them, just delete them.
It's good to see you too, Pop.
You too, Jake.
Travis smiled.
So, Shangri-La, what's it like there?
I don't have the words to explain it. It's just paradise.
Jake smiled. He was relieved that the suffering his parents endured during the attack at least resulted in them moving on to a higher plane of existence. They were happy there.
Was this my fault?
What?
The thing I brought it to the colony. Was it a bomb? Some kind of weapon? Is that what happened to Lhasa?
Jake was surprised to hear his father assume blame for the tragedy. He was putting all of that responsibility on himself. He didn't want his father to carry that burden. He began constructing a tale in his head to absolve his old man, but he needed more information.
What do you remember, Pop?
My last update was in the morning, on the way to the house. Did I tell you or your mother about the alien object that I found?
Jake had the context he needed to proceed with his tale.
You told us that Station Security seized the egg and they were experimenting with it.
It was best to be vague when lying. He had planted the seed that would lead his father to the desired conclusion. By the look on his father's face, he concluded that his ruse worked. He also knew that his mother always updated at night. There was no way she had any memory of that day either. His mother Annabelle flickered into existence next to Travis. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He had seen his mother's true form before, but never full scale. He'd only seen her true face in small holograms. Seeing his parents together in the holographic flesh, Jake felt that they complemented each other. Are you okay, baby?
I'm fine, Mom.
Why are you hiding your hand, Jake Takeda? Nothing escaped this woman's gaze. Maybe this was where Jake got his heightened perception from. Jake shyly pulled his left hand from his pocket and showed it to her.
I didn't want to worry you.
Oh no, my poor baby.
Mom, I'm not a kid anymore. I'm okay. I need you to understand that.
Anne was taken aback by his response, but for the first time, she respected his confidence. Jake had matured since their last meeting. It suits you.
Mom, how did you and Pop meet?
Anne was surprised by her son's sudden interest in her past. Where did this come from?
I don't know. Just curious.
Well, we met in college. He used to sit behind me in literature class.
I was so cool back then. All the ladies were into me.
Your dad was really weird and really shy back then. She lovingly looked at Travis, but he was funny. No one made me laugh like he did.
Your mom was way out of my league, but when I first laid eyes on her, I just knew.
Travis lovingly looked at Anne.
She was the one.
Anne smiled back at him.
I was pretty bad at being a husband and a dad, but...
Did I make you feel that way?
No.
Anne reached out her hand in an attempt to comfort Travis, before remembering that they couldn't touch in this state. Neither of us was perfect. They shared a longing gaze. Anne looked back at Jake and her eyes went wide. You've met a girl, haven't you? She smiled. Truly no detail or nuance escaped this woman.
No. Maybe it's complicated.
It's always complicated.
Yeah, but this is really complicated.
Is she nice?
Yeah. She's kind, strong. I think you'd really like her.
What's her name? Before Jake could answer, a voice interrupted over the intercom.
I'm really sorry, but we have to wrap this up. A lot of people are waiting to use the system.
Jake stood up from the chair. He knew what he wanted to say, what he had to say, but he'd never said it out loud. He'd taken these people for granted his whole life, and now was the time to finally say those words.
Mom, Pop, I...
Don't make this weird, son.
Travis joked. Anne giggled. You really are the worst, honey. She held out her transparent hand near Jake's cheek, almost close enough to touch. Take care of yourself, son.
We believe in you, Jake. Always remember that.
The holographic projectors stopped spinning and went dark. Jake's parents gradually faded away. Catherine finally managed to steal herself away from the outpost personnel and grateful survivors who yearned to meet her after her moving speech aboard the pods. She had one concern that nagged at the back of her mind. What did the boy say in his debriefing with the military interviewers? Everyone was required to give his or her account of the incident. Jake's account could shine some light on Catherine's involvement in the tragedy. A frame going berserk was unheard of. A keen eye with the right level of clearance could identify Liberty Shield as the cause of that incident. The top brass of the military and governmental agencies would be poring over every eyewitness account of what happened on Lhasa. Her name would eventually come up. She had been studying the patrols outside the server room for close to 2 days. Around midday, there was always a half-hour gap before the next patrol. Lunchtime, presumably. The console near the door was standard encryption. It was nothing that a tech-savvy person like her couldn't get past in a matter of minutes. A guard passed by and Catherine leaped into action. Her heart was racing as she hacked the console to open the door. This is like one of those spy movies, she thought. The server room door slid open and she darted inside, clutching her datapad to her chest. The server room was filled with ebon pillars that connected the floor to the ceiling. Intermittent cubes of light danced on the surfaces of each pillar. Catherine never felt so at home as when she was away from others and surrounded by technology. She closed her eyes and caressed her fingers down a server pillar, feeling its myriad textures. She stopped when her hand brushed upon an access port. She opened her eyes, attached a cable to the port, and then connected her datapad. She was immersed in her element. It didn't take her long to find the interview data files. Catherine was working on a hack to get around the data file encryption matrix when a deep male voice called out to her.
Hey, what are you doing here?
She looked over her shoulder in shock. It was a military guard, and he was a mountain of a man. His right hand rested on his sidearm, still within its holster on his belt.
This area is off limits to civilians,
he declared as he slowly approached. Catherine couldn't think of a way out of this predicament. The man recognized her and removed his hand from his weapon.
Hey, aren't you Kathy Fisher?
Catherine.
I know you've been through a lot, but you can't be in here. What are you doing?
Sympathy. She could use that. There was still a way to turn this situation around and avoid repercussions. She stood up and placed her right hand on his wrist. She intentionally quivered her lower lip.
I'm so sorry, Captain. I can explain. There's a boy. He's like a little brother to me.
Catherine managed to make her eyes tear up.
He's suffering after the attack. I'm trying to get him help, but he won't tell me what happened.
That's terrible.
If I could see his debrief, learn what happened to him, maybe I can help him move on.
I get it, but this is against the rules.
Sometimes?
She couldn't believe the words that were about to come out of her mouth.
Sometimes you have to break the rules to help the people you care about.
The large man's eyes trembled as he considered lending his aid to her. He just needed a little push.
Please, I can't do this alone.
She meekly held onto his large hand with both of her hands. Her watery eyes quivered as she stared at him. The man gulped.
Okay, I can give you 10 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Catherine sat down and got back to work on her datapad, amazed that her ploy was so effective. She couldn't resist testing her new powers a little further.
Could you keep an eye on the door?
Yes, ma'am.
The burly man awkwardly jogged back to the entrance to keep lookout. Catherine couldn't help but quietly giggle to herself. Just a little. People want to follow, she thought. They'll bend the knee to anyone with the will to lead. She didn't need a commanding presence or a silver tongue. Just a strong will. People would follow her because that's what they're wired to do. They instinctually relented to the strong, no matter how that strength presented itself. Catherine got back to the task. After a minute or so, she broke the encryption into the files.
Okay, Jacob Takeda. What did you have to say?
She viewed the file's length. Whatever Jake told the interviewer, it wasn't long. There was no mention of the killer frame or the red girl. Catherine was in the clear, but now new questions had arisen. What was this kid hiding? Why didn't he spill the beans? She had gotten what she wanted, but now her time was up. She heard the guard's lumbering footsteps heading towards her. This was her cue to get back into character. As he grew closer, she stood from her chair, hugged him around the waist, and buried her face into his muscular chest.
I'll never forget this.
The fake tears were getting easier for her to conjure up.
You're my hero.
No problem, ma'am. Just doing my job.
She feigned gratefulness as she backed out of the server room.
You just did the opposite of your job, moron.
Catherine had found her sword, the tool she would use to take the splendor that life owed her. She was done being a kindly doormat that others would trample upon. She vowed to kill everything soft within her. No one would take advantage of her ever again. She would protect her pride even if it made the universe her enemy. It would be a lonely path. She was used to being alone, but she would no longer be ignored. Jake walked the hallways of Trinity Outpost. Something was bothering him, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. The joy he experienced after seeing his parents had soured for some unknown reason. But why? He stopped in front of a large viewport. Was he destined to forever be unhappy? Was he cursed to analyze the joy out of his every moment? but regardless, something was amiss. He still hadn't updated. He couldn't until he identified this unease he felt. He touched the bridge of his nose out of habit, then it hit him. He picked up this awkward mannerism from his dad. It was an unconscious gesture his father performed, a gesture that was ingrained in him. So much so, he passed it on to his son. The hologram of Travis Takeda didn't engage in the ritual even once, but unconsciously touching the bridge of his nose was a part of who Travis Takeda was. Why would that detail be missing from the hologram? Jake looked at his new left hand. It didn't shake like his original hand, but he could feel his phantom limb trembling.
Your soul, your spirit. It is your link to your ancestors. It links you to God.
That was what Adeola believed in. Is that what a soul is? The fine details of a person, those little nuances that make them truly unique? Are we more than just our memories? His heart nearly broke as he thought of his mother.
Did I ever really meet her? What were her nuances?
He perceived motion nearby. A crowd had formed around Jake as he was lost in thought. They were looking out of the viewport. Jake turned to see a vast battleship floating by. The Reprisal was the jewel of the Terran fleet. It was a vast vessel close to the Arez juggernaut in size. The refugees of Lhasa crowded the large viewport to gaze at the majestic construct. It was no accident that the enormous battleship was being paraded past the survivors who were having their wounds and spirits mended at Trinity Outpost. The military's goal was to reassure the public of their strength. Losing an entire colony in a surprise attack reflected poorly on them. They relaxed their guard, and thousands died due to their negligence. There were other ships present, but they were hard to see beyond the Reprisal's enormity. The Sword of Justice lurked in the Reprisal's shadow. It was an A-class battleship. Based on the direction these vessels were sailing, it was easy to conclude that this was a retaliation fleet. A flagrant attack such as the Lhasa tragedy could not go unpunished. It was likely these ships were mobilized to bombard the Arez colonies near the edge of neutral territory. The colonial fleet was on its way to declare war. Jake thought of his role in the impending carnage, and he felt sick to his stomach. His mistake in his father's workshop had led to this. More souls would be lost to violence because of his actions. His mind reeled at the horror that was about to transpire. He felt a tap on his left shoulder. He looked back, but no one was there.
What's up, Slick?
It was David Assad standing behind him on his right.
David, hey.
Just spoke with my mom at Shangri-La.
I'm sorry, Dave. She didn't make it out?
Jake asked while absorbing all of the guilt for her loss.
Stop that.
Stop what?
Stop apologizing for crap you didn't do. It's annoying.
He had a frank way of checking Jake. Jake spent so much time engrossed in his own thoughts. He needed a reality check every now and then. He was trying to think of something comforting to say.
It was kind of nice.
David watched the ships.
My mom, not having to struggle anymore. She's better off at Shangri-La.
Jake decided it was only fair to allow David this sense of peace. He didn't want to burden him with his new revelations. He barely understood the concept of a soul himself. David gazed at the ships, lost in thought until he noticed Jake's new hand.
Whoa, let me see the new grip. Man, they replaced that fast.
Jake held up his robotic hand and displayed it to him.
Yeah, it hurt like crazy.
I'm kind of jealous. You're gonna get so much play with that thing.
What?
Girls, stupid. They love mysterious, broken guys.
I'm broken and mysterious?
Yeah, you lost your arm escaping the space colony. The story alone gets you your first date.
They laughed for a minute before Jake spoke up.
Dave, are we friends now?
Man, you're so weird.
Yeah, I kind of figured that out the last couple of days.
And here I thought you were a fast learner.
David reached out for a handshake with his left hand. Jake reached back with his right.
No, I want to shake the robot hand.
Come on, man.
Robot hand or no deal.
Fine.
Jake offered his new cybernetic hand.
Jerk.
David shook his hand to seal the deal.
I gotta admit, it's pretty boss.
Yeah, I guess it is kind of boss.
Jake let go and held his new hand out towards the viewport.
So, what now? You gonna bring your parents back?
No. War orphans are sent to the military academy.
David was surprised by Jake's answer.
Whoa, that's where I'm stuck going. But you have options. Why would you?
I've been cowardly, selfish. People were hurting all around me, and I was too self-absorbed to even notice. I don't want to go back to that.
It almost feels like I can't talk you out of this.
Jake clenched his robotic hand into a fist.
Right now, I feel like I'm moving forward. If I don't push myself...
You know there's a war coming, right?
Friends have each other's backs, right?
Yeah.
I got your back, Dave.
All right, I gotta admit, Takeda, got some bearings on you.
David laughed to himself. The two boys watched the fleet pass outside the viewport. The road ahead of them would be a difficult one, rife with hardships and tragedy, but they would face those adversities together as friends. Days later, the colonial fleet attacked the Arez settlements outside the neutral zone and officially declared war against them. To this day, the fighting rages on with no end in sight. The End. Versatile Layer. Book 1. The Red Girl.